On a cold December night in 1926, Agatha Christie's abandoned car stood silent by the roadside. Headlamps dimmed, doors ajar, the air carried a strange stillness. A coat lay folded inside, as though left in haste. Rumors spread quickly, and England whispered that the Queen of Mysteries had vanished into her own unwritten tale that drew England into deeper silence. Welcome, dear listener. Share when and where you join this journey, adding your voice to our quiet circle across time. Please consider subscribing to support this gathering of shared memory. The faint echo of those distant footsteps lingers in the air, and from that fading sound, we step gently into the wider world that once surrounded Agatha Christie. A world still trembling from the changes of a new century. England in the early 1900s was a land caught between ages, where gas lamps dimmed as electric light slowly claimed its place, and carriages gave way to motor cars that rattled uncertainly through fog-filled streets. It was a time when people still wrote letters by hand, yet dreamed of inventions that might one day shrink great distances. In such a setting, mysteries lived not only in fiction, but in the unspoken corners of daily life. For secrets hid easily within the folds of quiet households, behind lace curtains, or beneath the polite smiles of strangers passing in the street. This was the world into which Agatha would step, not yet an author, not yet a figure of fascination, but a young woman growing in a society that moved cautiously between old traditions and new uncertainties. Stories were already everywhere around her, not in printed pages, but in the murmurs of adults, in the clipped conversations held at the dinner table, and in the unseen pressures drifting through the air like a soft, uneasy wind. In those days, people clung to order with all the strength they could gather. The Victorian age had passed, yet its shadow lingered, shaping notions of proper conduct, respectable behavior, and the roles assigned to men and women. England held tightly to the belief that its social fabric was firm and unshakable. But beneath that polished surface, lives were often touched by quiet sorrow, suppressed desires, and the discomforts that polite society preferred not to name. It was in these subtle tensions that young Agatha learned to listen, to observe what others overlooked, and to notice the tremor behind a voice or the flicker in a person's expression. She was growing up in a world that believed women should remain soft-spoken and compliant, yet she carried within her a fledgling curiosity, the kind that turned silence into clues and small gestures into hidden chapters. One might imagine her watching the grown-ups with wide eyes, wondering what truths lay beyond the spoken words, sensing that people often hid more than they revealed. As the century advanced, the Great War would cast its shadow across Europe, shaking the world apart in ways no one had imagined. The horrors of battle altered more than maps. They shifted the minds and hearts of those who lived through them. Something fragile within society cracked. Certainties that once felt unbreakable were swallowed by grief, disillusionment, and a longing for answers to questions too heavy to articulate. It was in this aftermath, when the world itself felt wounded, that a hunger for stories of order and resolution quietly grew. People longed for tales where chaos was untangled, where truth emerged from cunning deception, and where justice was restored through keen observation and calm reasoning. Perhaps that hunger explains why a writer like Agatha Christie would later become so deeply cherished. In her stories, the chaos of life could be briefly reshaped into clarity, and the unknown could be met with a firm, guiding hand. Yet before she became that guiding hand, before her voice carried across continents, she was simply a woman walking through a time of great uncertainty, trying to understand her place within it. Context, after all, is not merely the background to a life. It is the soil in which every seed of a person's nature takes root. The stories Agatha later wrote, full of cunning puzzles and keen psychology, were shaped by the whispers carried through her early world. The the rustling leaves of Torquay gardens, the mild chatter of seaside visitors, the quiet withdrawal of English households that seldom revealed their inner struggles, all seemed to form a subtle tapestry of observation. And in such an environment, where politeness often served as a veil, a child who looked closely could see how stories were not created but uncovered. Every person carried their own small mystery. Every house contained its own private history. Could it be that the very structure of English life taught her that truth was rarely simple, and that beneath tranquil surfaces lay conflicts waiting to be discovered? Perhaps this is why she later wrote with such calm precision, offering puzzles that reflected the world as she had learned to see it, orderly to the eye, but full of hidden pathways beneath. As the years moved toward the fateful period of her adulthood, this quiet tension between order and uncertainty became more pronounced in England. New movements challenged old expectations. Women sought greater freedom, though many still faced rigid boundaries. The classes shifted slowly, but the echoes of hierarchy persisted. Trains, telephones, and newspapers carried new ideas through towns and villages. Yet many families continued to cling to the familiar customs of earlier days. A generation stood between two worlds, feeling the tremor of change, but uncertain of how far it might reach. Into this delicate landscape, Agatha's voice would eventually rise, not through bold proclamations, but through calm stories that reflected the very ambiguity of her time. Mysteries suited the world because the world itself felt mysterious. Life did not unfold in straight lines, and neither did her tales. The questions she would one day pose in her novels were the same kinds of questions people whispered to themselves in real life. What lies beneath appearances? What motivates a seemingly ordinary person? What truth hides behind a carefully arranged facade? In this early context, then, her later disappearance seems almost foreshadowed, not in action, but in atmosphere. When a society values discretion above confession, when emotions are hidden behind respectable walls, and when a person learns to observe more than they reveal, it becomes easy for someone, even a well-known figure, to slip quietly into the shadows without warning. The threads of her life were woven into a world already accustomed to silence and secrets. So perhaps the stage for her most famous mystery was set long before the December night when she vanished. Long before the public would search for her, long before newspapers wrote her name in bold typeface, she lived in a world where slipping away was not unimaginable, and where even the most ordinary day carried a faint undercurrent of uncertainty. And now, as we stand at the threshold of her story, the soft echo of those fading footsteps returns. They come from a distant English lane where the air feels cool, the light is dim, and the sense of something unspoken hangs low over the evening. What was beginning to stir in her life? What quiet forces were gathering, unnoticed by those around her? The answer remains veiled, for this is only the first glimpse into the landscape she once walked. The dim echo of those fading footsteps lingers in the mind like a thin trail of fog, and from that hush, we drift toward the beginnings of the woman whose name would one day circle the globe. Agatha Mary Clarissa Miller entered the world quietly in 1890, in a house warmed by gentle comforts and English mildness, a place where the sea spoke softly in the distance and the gardens of Torquay held the scent of roses and salt. Hers was not a dramatic birth into hardship, nor a storm-tossed childhood. Instead, she grew in a world that allowed imagination to flourish, protected by parents who cherished calmness and believed children should be raised with patience rather than pressure. Yet sometimes it is in such tranquil soil that the most complex inner lives form, for silence gives thoughts room to wander. Agatha's early days became a tapestry woven from freedom, solitude, and the quiet observations of a girl who listened more than she spoke. Her father, Frederick, was a gentle soul with an American upbringing and a temperament inclined toward kindness rather than stern discipline. Her mother, Clara, carried a belief that children should learn at home, shielded from the sharper edges of society until they were ready to face them. Thus, Agatha was taught not in classrooms filled with chatter and competing voices, but in the softened atmosphere of her own home, guided by books, stories, and the slow rhythms of daily life. She developed a fondness for tales even before she could fully read them, listening to narratives spun by those around her, absorbing the cadences of storytelling until they began to shape her own inner world. Was it here, one wonders, that the seed of curiosity took root? For a child raised in gentle isolation often sees more keenly when she steps into the world beyond her garden, noticing details others pass by without a thought. The Miller household was comfortable though not extravagant. There were afternoon teas, walks through the lanes of Torquay, and the presence of older siblings, whom young Agatha both admired and observed from a slight emotional distance. She was the youngest, a quiet watcher, and perhaps this position allowed her to grow both imaginative and introspective. When one is the last to be heard, one often becomes the first to notice subtlety. Childhood games, overheard whispers, and the peculiar habits of neighbors drifting past their gate, these were the raw materials that would later shape her understanding of human nature. The stories she loved were not merely entertainments. They became small studies in behavior, for tales often reveal what real people conceal. Yet even in this peaceful setting, life bore its shadows. Her father's health was fragile, and his gentle nature could not shield the family from the uncertainties that gathered slowly like distant clouds. When Agatha was 11, he died unexpectedly, leaving her world fractured. The comfort of her early years did not vanish at once, but a certain innocence faded. Loss entered her life quietly, teaching her the ache of absence, the way grief reshapes a household, and how adults attempt to maintain composure even when their hearts are breaking. Perhaps it was then that Agatha learned to read the emotional currents beneath spoken words, sensing the difference between what people say and what they feel. This quiet awareness would later become the foundation for her psychological puzzles, the subtle shift of a voice, the fleeting glance, the motive hidden in plain sight. After her father's death, the household tightened its purse strings. Though Clara did her best to keep the atmosphere warm, Agatha continued to learn at home, but now there was a faint tension beneath the tranquility, a sense of responsibility and self-reliance forming in her character. She turned to writing as a private refuge, crafting little poems and stories, not with the intention of publication, but as a way to give shape to the whirl of thoughts that swirled in her young mind. Writing became her quiet companion, a confidant that accepted sorrow and joy with equal grace. And as she matured, her talent grew not through force, but through the natural unfolding of her inner life. The written word became the gentle river on which her emotions traveled, forming channels that would one day lead toward the vast landscape of her literary career. As she entered her later teens, the world around her began to widen. She traveled, she met new people, she encountered personalities far more colorful and unpredictable than the tranquil figures of Torquay. The more she observed, the more she seemed to sense the complexity of human character. She saw how desire could disguise itself as charm, how frustration simmered beneath polite smiles, and how fear often wore the mask of propriety. It was during these years that Agatha began to understand not merely how people behaved, but why. And perhaps this is the true root of her gift. She did not judge the contradictions within a person. She studied them with quiet fascination, as though each individual carried a small mystery worth unfolding. Motivation can be difficult to trace in a person's life, for it is rarely formed in a single moment. In Agatha's case, the desire to write mysteries may have emerged gradually from the blending of curiosity, solitude, and the faint undercurrent of loss running through her early years. Mystery, after all, is a genre that thrives on unanswered questions, on the tension between appearance and truth, and on the attempt to restore order to a world threatened by chaos. It is not surprising that someone who experienced both comfort and disruption might be drawn to stories that explored the balance between the two. Nor is it surprising that a young woman who listened closely to the unspoken world around her would later craft characters whose motives were shaped by quiet tensions, hidden wounds, or secret desires. And so her origins formed a subtle foundation, a childhood filled with warmth, yet touched by sorrow, a girl who grew into a young woman with a mind both imaginative and analytical. She carried within her both the softness of early comfort and the resilience born from loss. These threads wove themselves into her early motivations, guiding her not toward fame, but toward expression. She wrote because she felt compelled to shape the world in words, to understand it through narrative, and perhaps to soothe her own uncertainties by resolving them on the page. Yet little did she know that these private impulses would one day transform her into the most widely read novelist of her time. As the young Agatha sits beneath the warm glow of a lamp, pen in hand, her face half lit by its gentle light, one cannot help but wonder what thoughts passed through her mind in those early moments of creation. Did she sense the path her life would take? Did she realize that the quiet stories she shaped in solitude would echo through future generations? Or did she write simply to ease the restlessness that comes from seeing the world more deeply than others realize? Her hand moves across the paper, forming words that only she will read for now. Outside, the evening deepens, and the soft murmur of the sea rises like a whisper beneath her window. The lamp flickers slightly, casting a shifting glow across her writing table, as though marking the delicate threshold between the world she inhabits and the worlds she is beginning to create. It is here that her path silently widens, leading her toward a future she cannot yet imagine, a future shaped by stories and shadows, triumphs and secrets. And as she writes, the room grows still, leaving only the gentle scratch of her pen drifting through the quiet night. The soft scratch of her pen fades into the quiet night, and from that fading sound we move gently into the years when young Agatha, no longer sheltered by childhood's familiar walls, entered the vast and unpredictable terrain of adulthood. It is in this transition that the first true tremors of danger begin to stir around her, though they appeared at first in the form of ordinary life changes rather than dramatic events. The world was shifting, its foundations unsettled by the Great War, and in the midst of these transformations, Agatha stepped forward with a heart both hopeful and uncertain. She had been raised in a household that valued imagination and gentleness, yet the wider world offered harsher lessons, ones that demanded resilience rather than dreaming. It was during this time that she met the man who would alter the course of her life in ways she could never have foreseen. A man whose presence would stir both deep affection and profound sorrow, Archibald Christie. Archie entered her world with the energy and confidence of youth, a striking contrast to her quiet introspection. He was straightforward, ambitious, and possessed a certain charm that swept her into a new rhythm of living. His uniform, his clear gaze, and his direct manner must have seemed to her like an invitation into a future filled with movement and purpose. For a young woman raised within the soft walls of Torquay, Archie was a gust of wind from beyond the familiar horizon, offering change rather than calm. And so, with the mixture of excitement and innocence often found in early love, she stepped toward him, unaware that the path she chose held shadows as well as light. Love, after all, does not merely open the heart. It exposes its vulnerabilities, making it tender to wounds that have not yet formed. Their early years together unfolded against the backdrop of war, a time when the entire world held its breath. Agatha, eager to contribute, joined as a volunteer nurse, tending to wounded soldiers with steady hands and quiet compassion. It was here, surrounded by bandages, whispered confessions, and the ceaseless arrival of those injured by unseen forces, that she came face to face with the darker aspects of life. The hospital wards were filled not only with suffering, but with stories, fragments of lives interrupted, secrets murmured by men who did not expect to see another sunrise, details of weakness or regret released in moments of vulnerability. This environment sharpened her ability to observe human nature, and with time, she came to understand how fragile the line between order and chaos truly was. The war did not simply affect nations. It entered homes, stole futures, and reshaped the emotional landscapes of ordinary lives. Yet even as she tended to the injured, Agatha found herself holding fast to the idea of a future with Archie. Their marriage in 1914 was a moment of hope amidst the uncertainty, a promise whispered against the roar of distant battlefields. They carved out small pockets of normalcy where they could, finding brief moments to laugh, plan, and imagine a life that might one day be peaceful again. And when the war finally ended, bringing with it a cautious sense of relief, Agatha must have believed that the worst was behind them. But wars leave silent scars, and the wounds carried by survivors are not always visible. Archie, with his stern discipline and love of structure, returned to a world that no longer fit his expectations, while Agatha, shaped by her experiences in the wards, saw the world with deeper complexity. They were two people walking side by side, yet slowly growing in different directions. It was during these years of early marriage that Agatha's writing began to take a more serious form. Encouraged by her sister to attempt a detective novel, she approached the task not with pride, but with a mixture of curiosity and determination. The world around her was filled with puzzles, with contradictions, with people hiding private motivations beneath polished masks. Writing felt natural to her, as though she were arranging the scattered pieces of life into a pattern that made sense. The creation of Hercule Poirot, the meticulous Belgian detective with a keen eye for order, might have offered her a sense of stability that her life was beginning to lack. Poirot was everything the world was not: composed, rational, precise. Through him, she could impose clarity on confusion, transform uncertainty into resolution. Her first novel, published after some difficulty, opened a door she would continue to walk through for decades. But success, even modest success, brings its own pressures. Expectations grew, deadlines loomed, readers wanted more, publishers wanted more. Archie, still adjusting to civilian life, wanted something she could not always provide: a wife fully devoted, uncomplicated, and constant. Their marriage, once strengthened by the shared hardship of wartime separation, began to feel strained under the quieter pressures of everyday life. Agatha's growing career, though admirable to many, created a subtle distance between them. For a man like Archie, who valued clarity and control, her world of stories, emotions, and imaginative wandering may have felt like something he could not fully grasp. The turning point was not a single event, but a gradual accumulation of small fractures, each one nearly invisible on its own, yet powerful enough to shift the foundation of their life together. There were arguments that left lingering silence in their wake, words spoken too quickly, apologies offered without conviction, and the slow but persistent sense that the harmony they once shared was quietly eroding. Agatha, sensitive and introspective, felt each change keenly. She struggled to reconcile her love for Archie with the growing awareness that he was slipping away from her, not in dramatic fashion, but in the subtle, almost imperceptible manner of someone drifting toward a different shore. Meanwhile, her creative world expanded. Success grew, recognition came. Yet the more she accomplished, the more she seemed to sense the fragile undercurrents running beneath her life. She built stories in which chaos was resolved, yet her own life felt increasingly unsettled, as though a storm were forming beyond the horizon. And perhaps, without fully realizing it, she began to carry within herself a quiet fear. that her personal world, so carefully nurtured and deeply cherished, might one day unravel. It is in this delicate intersection between rising fame and growing emotional strain that danger first entered her life. Not the danger of physical harm, but the inward danger of a heart stretched too far, of expectations too heavy, of loss too near. The turning point was not marked by a dramatic gesture, but by an evening's fragile silence following one of their quiet arguments, a silence so thin and tremulous it felt like a sheet of glass ready to break. And as that silence settled around her, something small yet significant shifted within her life's path, a shift whose consequences would one day draw the attention of an entire nation. The fragile silence lingering after that evening's argument stretches like a thin veil as we step into the next movement of Agatha Christie's life, a period defined by ascension and acclaim, yet threaded with shadows that deepened quietly beneath the surface. Her rise as a writer was not sudden, nor was it propelled by theatrical ambition. Instead, it unfolded with the same steady persistence that had shaped her childhood. A quiet dedication, a careful observation of life, and an unwavering need to make sense of the world through stories. But behind this ascent, beneath the polite applause of publishers and the growing admiration of readers, something more complex stirred, something that would become both the foundation of her brilliance and the quiet burden she carried in private. Her writing matured with each passing year, shaped by discipline as much as imagination. Agatha was not the kind of writer who waited for inspiration to strike like a bolt of lightning. She approached her work with method and patience. She built plots like intricate clockwork, turning each gear with deliberate care, testing each connection to ensure that nothing felt accidental. In this precision lay the secret of her genius. She understood that a mystery was not merely a story, but a puzzle, a delicate structure whose strength depended on balance. She created clues that were both fair and deceptive, characters who appeared simple yet concealed layers of depth, and settings that felt familiar enough to comfort the reader while harboring the unsettling possibility of hidden motives. Her worlds were orderly on the surface, but beneath them ran currents of greed, longing, jealousy, and fear, the very emotions she had spent a lifetime observing in silence. Success arrived gradually but unmistakably. With each new novel, her audience widened. The character of Hercule Poirot, once a creation born from the chance encounter of imagination and wartime experience, became a figure beloved by readers across England and beyond. His sharp mind, his impeccable manners, and his unwavering belief in order reflected a yearning many people held during the uncertain years that followed the Great War. He restored balance where life had taken it away. He solved what seemed unsolvable. He understood human motives with clarity. Perhaps Agatha saw in Poirot not only a detective, but a mirror of the world she wished she could inhabit. A world where logic triumphs over chaos, where the past can be reconstructed from scattered fragments, and where truth, no matter how deeply buried, eventually comes into the light. Yet even as her career flourished, a quiet darkness edged its way into her life, one made not of dramatic events, but of personal struggle, self-doubt, and the emotional strain that accompanied her growing responsibilities. Writing may have been her refuge, but it was also laborious, demanding, and ever-expanding. Readers expected more stories. Publishers pressed for new manuscripts. And in the midst of these pressures, the harmony of her marriage weakened. Archie admired her success, but did not fully understand it. He valued precision, routine, and control, whereas Agatha's world thrived on creative uncertainty. The more she accomplished, the more their lives diverged. She traveled for research, attended literary events, and began to inhabit the role of a respected author. Archie, increasingly restless, sought a life that felt simpler, less burdened by the complexities of her emotional world. In time, this divergence formed a quiet but widening chasm between them. Alongside these internal tensions lay other shadows, insecurities that Agatha rarely spoke of but carried deeply within her. Despite her success, she often doubted her abilities, believing her achievements might vanish as suddenly as they had appeared. She worried that each new story would be her last good one, that her mind might one day fail her, leaving her unable to craft the intricate puzzles her readers adored. This fear gnawed at her gently, a whisper in the back of her thoughts, reminding her that brilliance offers no guarantees. Perhaps this is why she worked so meticulously, refusing to leave a single thread unresolved. Her stories became her shields, her way of asserting control in a world she increasingly felt slipping away from her. The literary world, too, carried its own shadows. Critics often questioned her style, calling it old-fashioned or overly structured, unaware that her structure was intentional, her clarity a deliberate choice. She did not write to impress scholars. She wrote to illuminate the hidden corners of human behavior. But criticism, however mild, left marks on her sensitive heart. She was a woman who listened to whispers, who felt the weight of unspoken judgments. Praise warmed her, but it did not silence the tremors of doubt. She continued forward steadily, gracefully, yet always with the sense that her steps were taken upon fragile ground. Her personal world, meanwhile, grew increasingly fraught. Archie, once the bold figure who swept her into marriage, now felt distant, irritable, burdened by responsibilities he had not asked for and by expectations he no longer wished to meet. He found solace beyond their marriage, seeking companionship where emotional demands were fewer. Agatha sensed the change long before the full truth reached her. She felt it in his voice, in the way he averted his gaze, in the spaces between their conversations. The home they once shared with warmth now felt marked by tension, by moments of silence too heavy to ignore. Yet she clung to hope, to the belief that love might bend rather than break. Even as her emotional life grew turbulent, her literary world reached new heights. She became known not only for Poirot but for other characters as well. Miss Marple, with her gentle wisdom, Tommy and Tuppence, with their youthful energy, and countless others who seemed to walk off the page and into the lives of her readers. Her stories moved beyond mere entertainment. They became companions to people hungry for meaning, for clarity, for the comfort of seeing mysteries resolved. But there is irony in this rise. For while she offered resolution to millions, her own life was becoming increasingly tangled, its thread slipping beyond the grasp of logic or calm reasoning. The darker side of success is seldom visible to those who observe from afar. Fame can isolate, placing a person on a quiet pedestal from which it becomes harder to reach others. Agatha, though widely celebrated, found herself growing inwardly more alone. The demands of her work, the strain in her marriage, and the growing whispers of doubt formed a quiet storm within her. She tried to maintain balance, arranging her life as carefully as she structured her stories. But life does not follow the neat patterns of fiction. It shifts unexpectedly, collapses suddenly, and reshapes itself without warning. In these years, successful, admired, yet shadowed, one can sense a foreboding, a quiet inevitability building beneath the surface. It is as though she was living between two worlds, the world she created on the page, where every clue fit into place, and the world she inhabited, where emotional fissures widened despite her efforts to mend them. Her confidence, once gently nurtured by her early triumphs, began to falter. Her world, once filled with the comfort of routine, became uncertain, and on her writing desk lay an unopened letter, placed carefully beside a stack of manuscripts, its seal unbroken, its contents unknown, a symbol of something she feared to face or something she already knew without reading. The envelope rests there, motionless, holding its quiet weight as the room grows dim around her. The unopened letter rests motionless on her desk, its quiet weight deepening the dimness that has begun to settle around her life. and from that stillness, we drift into the most fragile and tumultuous chapter of Agatha Christie's early adulthood. For every life, no matter how carefully tended, reaches a moment when the ground shifts, when the familiar becomes uncertain, when the heart, stretched beyond its quiet strength, falters beneath the strain. Agatha had weathered years of subtle tension, the slow unraveling of her marriage, and the mounting pressures of a career that demanded both discipline and emotional sacrifice. But nothing prepared her for the convergence of losses that would soon extinguish the small, steady light she'd kept burning within herself. It was during this time, marked by grief, betrayal, and a growing fracture in her identity, that the foundations of her world collapsed, leaving her suspended between self-preservation and despair. The first blow was the death of her mother, Clara, in 1926, a grief so profound it seemed to tear through Agatha's life with the violence of a silent storm. Clara had been more than a parent. She had been her anchor, her confidant, the gentle guardian of her childhood imagination. Losing her was not merely losing a beloved figure, but losing the memory of tranquility itself. Agatha had always been sensitive to emotional shifts, and in her mother's absence, she felt the world tilt in ways she could not steady. Her writing slowed. Her confidence, fragile even in the best of times, dissolved into a quiet fog. She returned to Ashfield, the home of her youth, hoping its familiar rooms would cradle her through sorrow. Instead, she found shadows lingering where warmth once lived. Every corner recalled a memory. Every hallway echoed with an absence she could not bear to face. Grief often sharpens existing fractures, and while Agatha was navigating the depths of her loss, Archie was drifting further from her. Their marriage, already strained, could not withstand the weight of her sorrow. Archie, uncomfortable with emotional intensity, felt suffocated by her vulnerability. He sought escape, not through cruelty, but through retreat. Retreat into silence, into distance, and eventually into the arms of another woman. His affair, meticulously hidden for a time, became the final blow to the fragile stability Agatha had been struggling to preserve. When he confessed his intentions to leave her, the words fell like a shattering glass in the quiet of her life. The one person she believed would stand beside her during her darkest hours was now turning away. It is difficult to imagine the weight of such a moment. To lose one's mother and one's marriage within the same stretch of time is to lose the two anchors that often define a person's sense of belonging. Agatha's world, once built on gentle certainties, now felt unstable, foreign, and hostile. She moved through her days like a person trying to grasp something solid in a room that keeps shifting shape. Even her writing, the refuge she had always turned to, felt distant, as though the well from which her stories flowed had dried up under the pressure of her grief. Deadlines loomed, readers waited, publishers urged her forward, but she had nothing to give. Her mind, once so keen, so orderly, became clouded with sorrow, her thoughts spiraling into confusion. In the months following these upheavals, Agatha began to exhibit signs of deep emotional exhaustion. Friends noted her quietness, her sudden moments of distraction, her tendency to disappear into her thoughts as though searching for something she could not find. Archie no longer tried to help. His heart had moved elsewhere, and though he remained civil, he pulled away more firmly with each passing day. The silence between them grew with a coldness that could no longer be ignored. Agatha felt herself standing on a precipice, not simply the edge of a failing marriage, but the edge of her own emotional endurance. This was the setting for the night that would become etched into public memory. December 3rd, 1926. A night when the weight of sorrow, heartbreak, and confusion converged in the fragile center of her being. She left her home after another painful exchange with Archie, who had informed her more plainly than ever of his desire to end the marriage. The air outside was cold, pressing against her face like a reminder of how far she had drifted from warmth. She entered her car, started the engine, and drove into the night with no clear destination. her thoughts swirling between past comforts and the unbearable present. What happened in her mind during that drive is something perhaps only she ever truly knew. Did she seek escape, even momentarily, from the pain that threatened to overwhelm her? Did she hope the night's stillness might soothe her racing thoughts? Or did she simply wish to disappear from a world that no longer felt familiar, safe, or bearable? The answers remain buried in the silence she carried for the rest of her life. What is known is that her car was found abandoned near a chalk pit, headlights dimmed, belongings left behind in a way that stirred confusion and alarm. The scene suggested neither accident nor clarity, only a quiet unraveling. And in the days that followed, England would wake to the astonishing news that Agatha Christie, the celebrated author of intricate mysteries, had vanished without explanation. But before we reach those days of searching and speculation, we must linger for a moment in the emotional landscape that led her to that point. For her disappearance was not an isolated act. It was the culmination of years of internal conflict, the weight of grief and betrayal pressing so heavily upon her that something within her consciousness fractured. This fracture was not dramatic, not visible to those around her, but like a fine crack running quietly across glass, slowly widening until the fragile structure could no longer hold. One cannot help but ask, when faced with such sorrow, how much a heart can truly bear before seeking refuge in its own unraveling. How many losses must converge before the mind steps away from itself, if only to survive? Her breakdown did not arrive with thunder or violence. It came instead as a quiet collapse, a silent surrender, the kind of exhaustion that steals not strength, but identity. And as she drove into the cold night, the darkness around her seemed to echo the darkness within, each mile carrying her further from the life she had known. The car sits abandoned now in memory, its presence a symbol of the moment when a woman pushed beyond her limits disappeared from the world she had shaped with stories. Nearby, in the faint glow of early dawn, a single scrap of paper flutters against the breeze, its words unread, its meaning unresolved. The scrap of paper fluttering against the breeze settles slowly into the stillness of dawn, and it is from that delicate movement that we enter the bewildering days that followed Agatha Christie's disappearance, days when her private collapse became a public enigma, stretching from quiet villages to the bustling centers of London. What began as a personal breaking point soon transformed into one of the most extraordinary mysteries of the century, not crafted in the pages of a novel, but unfolding in the real world, where emotions are raw, clues are uncertain, and truth often slips through the spaces between what is seen and what is felt. In the cold light of morning, her empty car stood as a stark emblem of something deeply amiss, its presence stirring confusion among the first people to find it. The vehicle was discovered near a chalk pit, angled precariously as though abandoned in haste or despair, yet the scene offered little clarity. No signs of struggle, no trail of footprints leading away, only the eerie stillness that comes when a story moves beyond its expected course. Within hours, word spread through the countryside that a well-known writer had vanished. The authorities were summoned, and the initial investigation began with the quiet precision of routine procedure. But as soon as her identity was confirmed, the tone shifted. This was no ordinary disappearance. It was Agatha Christie, already a beloved name, already a public figure, already tied in the minds of readers to tales of cunning criminals and intricate clues. The irony of her vanishing did not escape anyone. Newspapers seized upon the story, reporting every detail with increasing urgency. Headlines swelled in bold typeface, weaving her private tragedy into a spectacle for the entire nation. People who had never read a single one of her novels now felt compelled to follow the unfolding mystery, while those who admired her work approached the news with a sense of disbelief. Could it be possible That the creator of so many careful puzzles had now become the center of one? As the search widened, thousands joined the effort. Policemen, volunteers, neighbors, and even fellow writers combed through the countryside, calling her name across empty fields and wooded paths. They searched bodies of water, inspected abandoned buildings, and retraced every possible route she might have taken. Lanterns flickered in the night as search parties continued into the cold hours before dawn. There was a sense of urgency, but also something more complex, a collective curiosity tinged with fear. Who could envision the fate of a woman who had built her life upon stories of danger and deceit? Rumors began to circulate almost immediately. Some believed she'd been kidnapped by an admirer or an enemy. Others feared she had harmed herself. Some whispered that she had staged her disappearance as part of a literary stunt, though those who knew her found the idea illogical and cruel. Still others speculated that she had done it to punish Archie, whose affair was not yet public knowledge but known to a quiet few. Theories multiplied faster than the authorities could address them. Even as these speculations swirled, the investigation focused on tangible evidence, on the car, the discarded items, and the absence of any coherent trail. The vehicle contained her coat, which was puzzling given the winter cold, and papers that seemed neither significant nor revealing. Detectives examined tire tracks and footprints in the dust, but nothing offered a story with a clear beginning or ending. It was as if she had stepped out of her life and vanished into the thin air of a December night. Some investigators wondered whether she had wandered off in a state of confusion, overcome by grief and emotional exhaustion. Others suspected a deliberate act, a carefully orchestrated retreat, but the truth remained hidden behind the veil of her disappearance. The search grew more frantic as days passed without a single confirmed sighting. Newspapers updated the nation with each new rumor, often embellishing the details to stoke public fascination. Agatha, known for her ability to capture the attention of readers, now found herself at the center of a narrative she could not control. Her face appeared on front pages, her name repeated in conversations across the country. The contrast between her usual quiet dignity and the sensationalism surrounding her disappearance felt striking, almost surreal. It was as though a character had walked off the pages of a novel and into the uncertain realm of reality, where clues did not align and motives could not be neatly deduced. The emotional impact on those closest to her, however, was far more complex than the public could see. Archie, already entangled in his own emotional turmoil, found himself thrust into an unwanted spotlight. His every move was scrutinized. His statements were analyzed for signs of guilt or concealment. Though he cooperated with authorities, the distance between him and Agatha had become a subject of speculation, a detail that colored the investigation with a darker shade. Friends and family expressed hope, but also confusion, unable to reconcile the Agatha they knew with the circumstances unfolding before them. Some felt she might have sought solitude, escaping under the weight of her sorrow. Others feared something irreversible had occurred. In the midst of this mounting uncertainty, the public's involvement took on an almost fervent quality. Letters poured into newspapers from readers offering theories. Amateur sleuths claimed to possess insight into her motives. Even spiritualists attempted to contact her through seances, seeking answers from realms unseen. The boundary between concern and spectacle blurred, and Agatha's disappearance became a cultural moment, a mystery that revealed as much about the society searching for her as it did about the woman herself. Was it empathy that drove the nation's obsession, or the irresistible pull of a narrative that mirrored the very stories she wrote? Perhaps it was both, a mixture of genuine fear for her safety and a fascination with the irony that the queen of crime fiction had herself become a riddle. Yet beneath the public uproar, there remained one haunting question. What had happened to Agatha Christie in those first hours after she left her home? Had she wandered aimlessly, consumed by grief and despair? Had she made a conscious choice to step away from her life? Or had something else occurred, something beyond the scope of speculation? The lack of answers deepened the mystery, leaving searchers uncertain where to look or what to believe. Night after night, as search parties continued their efforts, the call of her name drifted through forests and fields, carrying with it a blend of hope and dread. Each unanswered call echoed the uncertainty that had begun to grow not only around her disappearance, but around the very nature of identity itself. When a person vanishes, what part of them disappears first? The body, the mind, or the fragile thread that binds their story together? It is a question that seemed to linger in the cold air as the days stretched on. And there, in the growing silence of the 6th and 7th nights, a searcher paused at the edge of a darkened field, calling her name once more into the emptiness. His voice reached outward, fading slowly, unanswered, into the vast night beyond. The searcher's call fades into the vast night, thinning into silence as though swallowed by the dark itself, and from that unanswered echo we slip into the quiet, perplexing realm of Agatha Christie's missing days, those 11 nights and mornings that would trouble investigators, confound the public, and leave behind a riddle even she would never fully unravel. For what happened during that span cannot be captured through the tidy logic of one of her novels. It exists instead in the blurred territory between memory and instinct, where the mind shields itself from pain by retreating into shadow. The days that followed her disappearance did not offer clear answers. Instead, they offered glimpses, fragments of her journey, small pieces that would one day be linked together through official accounts, witness recollections, and the later reflections of those who tried to understand her. Yet even when these fragments are assembled, they form not a single truth, but a veil woven from both clarity and uncertainty. Agatha reappeared not in the wilderness where her abandoned car was found, nor in the frantic imaginations of those who feared the worst, but in the quiet, genteel town of Harrogate, far from the chalk pit, far from the frantic search, far even from the emotional storm she had left behind. She had checked into the Swan Hydropathic Hotel under the name Mrs. Teresa Neal, a choice that would later stir controversy because Neal was the surname of the woman Archie had been seeing. Whether this choice was deliberate or subconscious remains one of the enduring mysteries of the episode. Under this alias, she lived quietly, mingling with fellow guests, reading newspapers, taking part in small hotel events, and presenting herself as an ordinary, composed woman, one who bore no resemblance to the distressed figure the nation believed lost. Witnesses from the hotel described her as calm, neatly dressed, and polite. She dined alone or occasionally with other guests, conversed in a light, pleasant manner, and showed no outward sign of anxiety. To them, she was simply another visitor seeking rest. But beneath that gentle exterior must have existed a labyrinth of hidden emotion, a tangle of thoughts too fragile to surface. Was she aware that the entire nation searched for her? Did she sense the magnitude of the turmoil her absence had caused? If she did, she offered no hint. The newspapers lay available in the hotel lounge, some bearing articles about her disappearance, some merely speculating about her fate. Yet when she glanced at them, if she glanced at all, she betrayed no reaction. Her quietness was unsettling, not because it seemed unnatural, but because it seemed like the quietness of someone whose mind had stepped aside from itself. Amnesia is one explanation often offered for these days, an episode of dissociation brought on by trauma, overwhelming grief, and emotional collapse. Those who support this theory argue that her behavior was consistent with a person operating on the faintest thread of conscious awareness, navigating life on a surface level while the deeper self remained hidden. Others believe the opposite, that she acted purposefully, seeking an escape from the unbearable pressures that had enveloped her, that she wished, consciously or not, to disappear from her life, if only briefly, that she chose a place where she would not be recognized and crafted an identity that allowed her to breathe without the suffocating weight of grief, betrayal, and expectation. Between these interpretations lies a quiet truth. The human mind is far more delicate than we often admit, capable of both protecting itself and fracturing in ways that defy simple explanation. When the heart is wounded, when sorrow becomes too heavy to bear, the mind can retreat into shadows, creating its own refuge, a sanctuary or a prison, depending on how one sees it. Which of these the swan hydropathic was to Agatha remains uncertain. For 11 days, the search widened, the theories grew more elaborate, and the nation held its breath. People claimed to see her in distant towns. Others reported possible clues that led to dead ends. Some feared she had taken her own life. Some believed she had staged a disappearance to spite Archie. Still others imagined more sinister possibilities. But while speculation swirled, she sat in the hotel foyer reading a book or walked quietly along the corridors, her presence so ordinary it seemed almost unreal when viewed in light of the nationwide panic. It was a musician at the hotel, however, who first reported her to the authorities, recognizing her from the newspaper photographs. His concern was not dramatic. He simply felt something was amiss. A woman sought by an entire country should not be sitting quietly by the fire under another woman's name. Within hours, the police arrived, and it was Archie who journeyed to Harrogate, tasked with identifying the woman who had once been his wife in all but name. When he stood before her, she appeared calm, composed, perhaps even distant. Reports vary on what she said and how she reacted. Some say she seemed dazed, as though waking from a dream. Others say she looked at him with quiet recognition. The line between truth and interpretation blurs here, for the witnesses brought their own emotional coloring to the moment. What remains is the image of Agatha, sitting in the hotel foyer, hands folded, waiting for something known only to her. It is an image that lingers, a woman both present and absent, seen yet obscured by the haze of her own unraveling. When she left the hotel with Archie, the public's fascination only deepened. The explanations offered, amnesia, emotional collapse, exhaustion, satisfied some and angered others. The press declared her actions irresponsible, theatrical, or contrived. Her readers were divided between sympathy and bewilderment, and she herself maintained a quiet silence, rarely discussing the episode for the remainder of her life. Perhaps she feared the memories. Perhaps she wished to protect the fragile part of her mind that had led her there. Or perhaps she understood that the truth, whatever it was, could not be spoken without being misunderstood. In the dim quiet of the Swan hydropathic lobby, where she had sat for nights with a calm no one could decipher, one can imagine the soft glow of lamps casting shadows that flickered gently across her face. Shadows of a woman who had slipped behind the veil of her own thoughts, not lost, but unreachable. And there, in the lingering hush of that memory, she sits a moment longer, hands folded neatly, as though waiting for something the world would never fully grasp. The quiet glow of the Swan hydropathic's lamps lingers like a faint afterimage, and from that softened light, we step into the moment when Agatha Christie was finally found, an event that should have brought closure, yet instead opened deeper rifts of confusion, judgment, and controversy. Her reappearance did not end the mystery, it scattered it into new shapes. When Archie arrived to collect her and the authorities confirmed her identity, the public expected a revelation, a confession, or at least a coherent recollection. Instead, they were met with uncertainty, fragmented explanations, and a silence heavy enough to trouble even those who wished to defend her. The world had spent 11 days imagining her fate, weaving theories in their minds and projecting their expectations onto her. But reality, when it finally surfaced, carried no dramatic arc. It arrived quietly in a hotel foyer with Agatha sitting almost serenely, her demeanor neither hysterical nor jubilant, but distant, like someone awakening slowly from a long, indistinct dream. Reports from those first encounters vary. Some witnesses insisted that she looked directly at Archie yet showed no recognition, as though he were a stranger standing before her in a dream she could not interpret. Others claimed she spoke mildly, addressing him without surprise. Still others noted that she appeared dazed, but not distressed, as if the edges of her consciousness were smoothed over by a protective haze. This divergence in observations would later become part of the controversy, for no one, not even the investigators, could state with certainty what she remembered and what had slipped beyond reach. The physicians who examined her in the days after the discovery offered the explanation of temporary amnesia, likely caused by trauma, emotional shock, and exhaustion. It was a plausible conclusion, one that aligned with what had been known of her fragile state before her disappearance. Yet the public, hungry for clarity, found the explanation oddly insufficient. Archie, whose own involvement had been scrutinized during her absence, stood uneasily at the center of this ambiguous return. His actions in Harrogate were polite, restrained, and noticeably stiff. Some judged him unsympathetic, others believed he had been humiliated by the spectacle, and still others suspected he had played a larger role in her disappearance. Whatever the truth, his presence at her side did not inspire confidence that reconciliation was possible. The air between them seemed thin and cold, as though both were walking across a fragile surface that could crack beneath the weight of any misstep. When they returned home together, the press swarmed, eager to hear Agatha speak, to glean from her expression some clue of her state of mind. But she offered little. She answered few questions, and did so with a gentleness that left reporters frustrated. Her withdrawal was not defensive, but inward, the way a person might retreat from a bright light after spending too long in shadow. The newspapers, deprived of a dramatic confession, filled the gaps with speculation. Some accused her of staging the entire disappearance to frame Archie or to gain sympathy from the public. Others insisted she had suffered a psychological break, a collapse brought on by grief, betrayal, and exhaustion. There were whisperings that she had attempted to start a new life under the name of her husband's lover, that she had sought refuge from emotional distress by inhabiting a different identity. Rumors grew in imaginative directions, some compassionate, others cruel. The press, eager for sensational angles, often chose the latter. Articles described her actions as unfeminine, irresponsible, or attention-seeking. They questioned her mental state, her morality, and even her integrity as a writer. Few considered the possibility that she was simply a woman in pain, navigating an emotional wound so deep that her mind had shielded itself through withdrawal. Yet despite this deluge of judgment, there were also readers, and some acquaintances, who felt a quiet sympathy for her. They saw in her disappearance the collapse of a woman who had always observed too closely, felt too deeply, and carried more than she ever shared. Those who had known her privately recognized the gentleness of her nature, the fragility that lay beneath her disciplined exterior. They understood that grief can fracture even the strongest spirits, and that the loss of her mother and the betrayal of her husband might have created an internal storm she could not weather publicly. For them, her silence was not suspicious, but protective, a way of shielding her wounded psyche from further injury. Still, the controversy refused to settle. The authorities closed the case, accepting the explanation of amnesia, but the public continued to pick at the threads of the story, unable to release their fascination. Journalists pressed for more details. Admirers wrote letters pleading for clarity. Publishers wondered how this event would affect her career. And throughout it all, Agatha remained calm, composed, and largely silent. She did not offer interviews. She did not write public explanations. She did not attempt to satisfy the world's hunger for answers. Instead, she focused on healing, withdrawing from the glare of speculation and allowing the furor to pass over her like a storm she could not control. Her silence became its own kind of answer, though it revealed little. Was she protecting herself? Protecting Archie? Protecting her daughter from the disgrace of public scandal? Or was she protecting the fragile, perhaps fractured parts of herself that still struggled to make sense of what had happened? The truth remains indistinct because Agatha herself allowed it to remain so. She would go on to live decades beyond the disappearance, shaping one of the most prolific and celebrated literary careers in history, yet she rarely spoke of those 11 days. In her autobiography, written many years later, she skimmed over the event so lightly that readers were left with more questions than before. This reticence, whether deliberate or instinctive, preserved the mystery that had surrounded her since 1926. Even today, scholars, psychologists, and admirers continue to debate the meaning of her disappearance. Some argue that she entered a fugue state, a condition in which memory fractures and the self walks a parallel path. Others believe she consciously fled from the unbearable pain of her life, seeking a temporary refuge in anonymity. And still others suggest a mixture of both, a deliberate departure that slipped into unconscious confusion once she was alone, overwhelmed, and emotionally unraveling. None of these explanations can be proven, and perhaps that is precisely why her disappearance endures in public memory. It resists resolution, defies easy interpretation, and remains suspended between truth and speculation, much like the puzzles she crafted with such care. Yet beneath the layers of controversy lies a simple human truth. She was a woman in profound distress, and distress does not always manifest in rational patterns or comprehensible actions. Sometimes the mind, overwhelmed by sorrow, chooses not clarity, but retreat. In the quiet of the hotel foyer, as she sat with her hands folded, waiting for something only she could sense, one might imagine an image left unresolved in the gentle glow of the lamps, a shadow passing across her face, so slight it could be missed, yet carrying within it the weight of an unspoken story. A murmur of gossip rises once more, drifting like smoke through the air, carrying questions that will never receive final answers. The faint murmur of gossip drifts like smoke through the air, and from that lingering haze we move into the quieter aftermath, the long, slow process of healing that followed Agatha Christie's return, a period seldom spoken of in histories, yet profoundly shaping the woman she would become. To the outside world, the scandal of her disappearance remained the central focus, but for Agatha herself, the true struggle unfolded in private, behind closed doors, within the fragile chambers of her heart and mind. Her reappearance did not restore her to the life she had known. It did not mend her marriage. It did not silence the pain that had driven her into the shadows. If anything, the days after she was found were more delicate than the days she spent in hiding, for now she had to confront the aftermath of an emotional break that had been witnessed by an entire nation. And yet she faced this fragile time with a quiet endurance, withdrawing inwardly to protect the parts of herself that still trembled. In the weeks immediately following her return to her home in Sunningdale, Agatha remained withdrawn, choosing silence over explanation. Those who encountered her noted a softness in her manner, but also a distance, as though she were moving through life slightly removed from its textures. She spent long hours alone, sometimes walking aimlessly through the countryside, sometimes sitting with a book but not reading it, sometimes standing at a window with a gaze fixed on something beyond the horizon. The mind, after breaking, does not return to itself immediately. It returns in increments, in small, trembling steps, and so each day brought her a little closer to the woman she had been, though the path forward was not straight, nor free of shadows. The strain within her marriage became more pronounced during this time. Archie, embarrassed by the public spectacle, grew increasingly distant. Where once there might have been shared tender moments, now there was a brittle politeness, a formality that made their interactions feel like exercises in endurance rather than expressions of affection. He still insisted on maintaining the appearance of unity for the sake of their daughter and their social position, but the effort felt hollow. His thoughts lingered elsewhere, and Agatha, sensitive to every shift in tone and gesture, felt his absence more keenly now that she had returned to the fragile world they once shared. The emotional distance between them, once a quiet space, had widened into something impassable. In this atmosphere of strain and quiet estrangement, Agatha's healing took on a solitary quality. She did not seek society, nor did she confide in many friends. Instead, she turned inward, navigating her emotions with a contemplative stillness that surprised even those who knew her well. Some believed she was ashamed of the uproar her disappearance caused. Others believed she was still piecing together her thoughts, recovering fragments of memory that had blurred into indistinct shapes. It is possible she felt both. Trauma does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it settles like a soft fog, muting the world and dimming the mind's ability to speak freely. Yet even in the midst of this fragility, her inner resilience did not abandon her. Slowly, so slowly it appeared almost imperceptible, Agatha began to rebuild the foundations of her life. She returned to writing, at first with hesitation, her mind still bruised by the emotional tumult she had endured. The words came stiffly, then haltingly, then with a faint return of the rhythm she had once trusted. Writing, for her, had always been a form of order, a way of shaping chaos into meaning. And though her mind had wandered into darkness, the act of creation now served as a gentle guide back toward clarity. Some scholars later argued that her writing became sharper after her disappearance, more introspective, more attuned to the psychology of human pain. Whether this was deliberate or instinctive remains unclear, but the shift is evident. Her stories began to carry subtler emotional undertones, the kind only someone who had walked through their own shadows could express. Her characters, too, reflected this shift. Hercule Poirot, once merely meticulous, became more contemplative, reflecting on human motives with a deeper sensitivity. Miss Marple, with her deceptively simple observations, embodied a wisdom shaped by quiet suffering. Agatha's understanding of human nature expanded, absorbing not only the flaws of others, but the vulnerabilities within herself. Her return to writing was not merely a resumption of craft. It was an act of restoration, a way of stitching together the torn threads of her identity. Still, her life at home remained delicate. Divorce, especially for a woman of her era and social standing, carried a heavy stigma. Yet the growing emotional distance between Agatha and Archie made separation inevitable. Their attempts to salvage their marriage faltered under the weight of unspoken sorrow, and eventually Archie asked for a divorce so he could marry the woman he loved. The wound this request inflicted was profound, but Agatha, who had already endured the breaking of her heart, accepted the truth with quiet dignity. Perhaps she understood that clinging to a fractured union would only prolong the pain. Perhaps she had found within herself a new strength forged by loss. Whatever the reason, she agreed, and the life they had once built together dissolved like the last trace of dusk fading into night. In the months that followed, Agatha sought refuge in movement. She traveled, sometimes alone, sometimes accompanied by friends, seeking new landscapes that allowed her mind to breathe. The unfamiliarity of foreign places offered her a kind of peace she had not felt in years. In the quiet corners of hotels, on ships traveling to distant shores, and among the ruins of ancient civilizations, she found a sense of distance from her wounds. Travel opened for her a new path, one that would later guide her toward unexpected companionship and creative renewal. Yet even as she moved forward, the echo of her disappearance lingered. Public speculation continued. Articles resurfaced from time to time, questioning her motives or interpreting her silence as proof of deception. But Agatha refused to engage. She kept her silence intact as though recognizing that the truth of her pain belonged to her alone. Some might call this avoidance, but perhaps it was something gentler, a deliberate choice to let the past rest, to carry its lessons quietly without reopening its wounds. Healing, after all, does not require explanation. It requires time. It requires gentleness. And it requires the courage to continue living when one's inner world has been shaken to its core. With each passing season, the weight of those chaotic days grew lighter. She settled into a rhythm once more. Quiet mornings, long walks, steady writing, the company of her daughter, and the unfolding of a life no longer tethered to a marriage that had long ceased to nurture her. Healing did not erase the past, but it softened its edges, allowing her to breathe without the tightness of grief constricting her chest. By the time she began to imagine a new chapter, one shaped not by sorrow but by slow, cautious hope, the sound of her past had diminished to a faint hum in the distance, and behind a closed door, somewhere in a quiet house, the ocean can be heard faintly through the window, its steady rhythm whispering that the world continues, and so must she. The faint whisper of the ocean beyond the window lingers like a quiet promise, and from that gentle rhythm we move into the chapter where Agatha, still fragile yet slowly regaining her strength, returned to the craft that had long been her shelter. Writing had accompanied her through childhood solitude, through wartime anxieties, and through the early tremors of marital strain. Now, after the upheaval of her disappearance and the painful dissolution of her marriage, it became something even deeper, a path not merely of expression, but of transformation. The woman who picked up her pen during this period was not the same woman who had written her earlier novels. She had been reshaped by grief and disillusionment, tempered by personal collapse, and awakened to the complexities of her own inner world. And as she began once more to weave stories on the page, the tone, texture, and quiet wisdom of her writing shifted with her. At first, her return to writing was cautious, almost tentative. The mind, after breaking, needs time to relearn its own rhythms, and the act of creation, which had once flowed like a gentle current, now came with hesitations and pauses. Yet even these pauses served a purpose. They allowed her to listen more closely to the subtle emotions that now informed her work. She no longer wrote simply to craft a clever puzzle or align the delicate mechanics of a plot. She wrote to understand the fragile threads that bind human beings to one another, to explore the hidden fractures beneath polite surfaces, and to give voice to the shadows she had walked through. Her stories became more introspective, not in obvious ways, but in the quiet, psychological undercurrents that ran beneath them. Poirot, once confidently analytical, now carried an air of reflective melancholy, as though aware that the human heart held mysteries that logic alone could not fully unravel. Miss Marple, too, seemed to gain new depth, her gentle observations tinged with the understanding that suffering often hides behind everyday gestures. Even her villains, once clear embodiments of greed or jealousy, began to emerge with subtler motives, less blunt, more human, often shaped by emotional wounds rather than simple malice. Readers, without fully realizing it, sensed this shift. They felt that her later works carried a resonance that had not been present before, a maturity shaped by experience. Her novels, after the disappearance, often contain themes of identity, memory, and psychological concealment, yet always presented with the calm, restraint characteristic of her style. For Agatha believed in clarity. She believed in simplicity. But now her simplicity held more weight. It was a simplicity earned through sorrow, not assumed through innocence. One of the most notable changes during this period was her renewed interest in structure. She began experimenting more boldly with narrative form, playing with time, perspective, and misdirection. Her puzzles became more daring, even audacious, as seen in works like The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, where the very nature of storytelling becomes part of the mystery. It is often said that trauma makes a person more cautious, yet Agatha moved in the opposite direction. Her experiences seemed to give her a strange courage, a willingness to challenge convention, to test what a mystery novel could contain. Perhaps the collapse of her personal world had loosened her from the constraints of expectation, allowing her creative instincts to roam more freely. Perhaps she felt that if she had survived her own unraveling, she could afford to take risks on the page. But even as her writing flourished, her personal world remained quiet. The divorce from Archie finalized in 1928, leaving behind both relief and a lingering ache. Though she had accepted its inevitability, the end of the marriage left her with a sense of displacement, an emptiness where partnership once existed. She was not free of sorrow, nor did she pretend to be. Instead, she carried her pain with a quiet dignity, allowing it to settle rather than attempting to banish it. She understood now, perhaps more deeply than ever, that healing is not the erasure of wounds, but the ability to live with them gently. During these slowly stabilizing years, writing became her companion, her stabilizing force, her way of restoring order to a world that had once felt impossible to navigate. But healing also required movement, and Agatha, always curious, began to travel once more. She attended gatherings, visited friends, and eventually embarked on the journey that would alter the next chapter of her life. The trip to the Middle East, where she would meet a man who would become her second husband, the archaeologist Max Mallowan. This transformation, however, belongs to a later part of her story. For now, she remained poised in a quiet space between the past and the future, rebuilding her life with the gentle persistence of someone planting seeds after a long winter, unsure which will take root, but planting them nonetheless. Her daughter Rosalind became one of her greatest sources of steadiness during this time. Agatha devoted herself to motherhood with renewed tenderness, striving to create a stable and nurturing environment despite the public scrutiny that sometimes resurfaced. She understood how easily the world can distort the private truths of a family, and she worked quietly to shield her daughter from the shadows cast by her own struggles. Their relationship deepened in these years, shaped by shared solitude and the quiet moments that come from living through difficulty together. Yet even as she found new rhythm in writing and motherhood, the memory of her disappearance lingered at the edges of her life. It did not glide away cleanly. Occasionally, it resurfaced in unexpected ways, whispered among acquaintances, referenced by journalists, or hinted at by those who believed they understood her better than she understood herself. But Agatha had learned how to carry silence with composure. She did not explain, justify, or revisit the episode. She allowed it to remain where it belonged, behind her, within her, but not governing her. A person who has walked through darkness does not always need to illuminate it for others. Sometimes survival itself is explanation enough. Her writing desk during this period became a sanctuary. Its familiar surface, often covered with manuscripts, notes, and freshly sharpened pencils, offered her the stability she craved. She wrote in longhand, shaping each sentence with a concentration that bordered on meditation. The hours she spent at her desk became the quiet axis around which her days revolved, and bit by bit, the woman who had once felt unmoored began to find her footing again. The motion of her pen, steady and unhurried, mirrored the slow return of her inner balance. By the time her confidence began to fully return, she had not only rebuilt her creative strength, but reshaped her emotional foundation as well. She was no longer the woman defined by loss and betrayal. She had become someone more resilient, more observant, and more attuned to the intricacies of the human heart. And on her writing table, beside a freshly inked manuscript page, lies a single sheet touched by a passing draft, its edge fluttering gently like the breath of a new beginning, unfinished yet full of promise. The single sheet fluttering gently in the draft settles at last, and from that quiet moment we move into the next unfolding chapter of Agatha Christie's life. A chapter built not from collapse, but from renewal, unexpected companionship, and the slow knitting together of a heart once fractured. For after sorrow comes a period of stillness, and from that stillness, life sometimes blooms again in ways unimagined. Agatha, having endured the emotional storm of her disappearance, The dissolution of her marriage and the long months of rebuilding her inner world now stepped into a subtle transformation. It did not arrive with dramatic fanfare. It came softly through travel, curiosity, and the gentle rhythm of rediscovering the world beyond grief. And it was in this quiet turning of the seasons that she met the man who would become her second husband and her steady companion for the rest of her life, Sir Max Mallowan. Their meeting took place on an archaeological expedition in the Middle East, an environment filled with ancient ruins, drifting sands, and the lingering echoes of civilizations long vanished. Agatha had embarked on the trip seeking a change of scenery, a breath of new air, and perhaps a reminder that life, like the landscapes she encountered, carried layers of history that shaped the present. At the time, she traveled with an inquisitiveness sharpened by her years of writing mysteries and by her recent personal trials. She observed everything: the texture of the earth, the distant calls of vendors, the patient concentration of archaeologists brushing gently at buried stones. It was a place where time seemed both frozen and fluid, where past and present coexisted in the same breath. Such a landscape must have appealed to her deeply, for she had always been drawn to hidden truths, to the stories buried beneath surfaces. Max Mallowan, younger than Agatha by 14 years, entered her life with a presence distinctly different from Archie's. Where Archie had been disciplined, structured, and emotionally guarded, Max was warm, patient, and quietly fascinated by her mind. He admired her not as a public figure, but as a woman of depth, intelligence, and gentle humor. Their companionship began simply: shared conversations, observations about the ruins around them, small kindnesses offered without expectation. Agatha, who had long learned to read people with sensitivity, sensed in Max an honesty that brought her comfort. He had none of the sharp edges that had wounded her before. Instead, he carried a steady calm, the kind of calm that comes from a person confident in his place in the world. As the days of the expedition passed, their companionship deepened with natural ease. Max showed her the intricacies of his archaeological work, explaining how each fragment of pottery held stories that could reshape historical understanding. She, in turn, shared her insights into character, motive, and the subtle patterns of human behavior, observations that both intrigued and delighted him. There was no intensity, no burden of expectation, only the gradual merging of two lives that seemed to recognize in each other a quiet compatibility. It was perhaps the gentleness of this connection that allowed Agatha's heart to open again. After the turmoil of her first marriage, she found solace in a relationship built on patience rather than passion, understanding rather than tension. Their marriage, in 1930, surprised some due to their age difference, but those who knew them well saw immediately how well suited they were. Agatha embraced Max's world with enthusiasm, joining him on excavations and embracing the challenges of remote landscapes. She learned to live in tents, to endure heat and dust, to appreciate the ancient history buried beneath the soil. Max, in turn, supported her writing with unwavering encouragement, creating a partnership in which both individuals nourished each other's passions. It was a balanced companionship, one anchored not by dramatic declarations, but by mutual respect and steady intimacy. Through these years, Agatha's writing blossomed anew, infused with the richness of her travels and the inspiration drawn from the archaeological settings she inhabited. Several of her novels from this period carry the distinct imprint of the Middle East, its deserts, its ruins, its enigmatic cultures. Works like Murder in Mesopotamia and Death on the Nile reflect not only her creative imagination, but her lived experiences among excavation teams, camels wandering near tents, and the steady hum of archaeological activity beneath a relentless sun. These landscapes became part of her artistic language, their ancient mysteries merging seamlessly with the puzzles she crafted for her readers. Her life with Max also brought emotional stability, offering her a sense of belonging she had once believed irretrievable. Their home in England became a place of warmth and comfort, filled with the artifacts of their journeys, the gentle clutter of books and manuscripts, and the kind of shared quiet that comes from two people content in each other's presence. Max valued Agatha not only as a partner, but as a brilliant mind, seeking her opinion on his work, inviting her to share in his successes, and respecting the private world of her writing. Their companionship was built on equality, not the social equality expected by the world, but an equality of spirit, the meeting of two individuals whose strengths complemented one another. During these years, Agatha's public image continued to grow. Her books sold in ever-increasing numbers, her characters became global icons, and her reputation as the queen of crime fiction solidified. But while the world celebrated her, she remained inwardly modest, preferring the quiet rhythms of her family life to the spotlight of public events. Fame had once overwhelmed her, contributing to her emotional collapse. Now, sheltered by Max's companionship, she found a way to navigate her public identity without losing her sense of self. She learned to accept admiration with grace, yet remained grounded in the quiet life she cherished. The years with Max were not without challenges. No life is free of them, but they carried nowhere near the emotional turbulence of her earlier adulthood. Instead, these years were defined by gradual healing, by creative renewal, and by the emergence of a woman who had learned to live with her past without being governed by it. She grew more confident, more serene, more reflective. She understood that pain does not vanish simply because joy enters one's life. Rather, they coexist, shaping a person into someone more layered, more compassionate, more attuned to the fragile intricacies of human experience. It was during one of their expeditions, as she brushed dust from a newly unearthed artifact, that she paused, feeling the gentle desert wind against her face. Perhaps she sensed, in that moment, how far she had traveled, not only across continents, but within herself. The woman who had once disappeared into darkness had now found a life built on steadiness and quiet joy. Yet even as she touched the edges of an ancient stone, the faint sound of an archaeological brush revealed something deeper, how the process of uncovering history resembled the uncovering of one's own heart. And there, under the vast and silent desert sky, the soft sweep of that small brush reveals something long buried, not in the earth, but in the memory of a life patiently remade. The soft sweep of the archaeological brush settles into the desert air, and from that patient motion we drift into a deeper chamber of Agatha Christie's life, the chamber where public perception and private truth begin to part ways, forming two distinct paths that she would walk simultaneously for decades. For though she had entered a calmer, steadier period with Max Mallowan, and though her writing flourished in ways even she had not dared to imagine, the world that admired her carried its own misconceptions. They saw the smiling author seated at book signings, the elegant figure attending literary events, the successful playwright earning applause from London audiences. But they did not see the woman beneath the image, the one who understood human frailty with an almost painful clarity, the one who navigated her life with caution, because she knew how easily the heart could break. Public adoration is seldom aligned with private reality, and in Agatha's case, the two would diverge slowly, creating a quiet duality that shaped the remainder of her life. Her days with Max carried a gentle rhythm, one of archaeological seasons, long stretches of writing, family gatherings, and the daily comforts of a shared partnership. Yet even as she found peace in this new life, she remained acutely aware of how the world saw her. She was often described as cheerful, untroubled, modest, and even quaint, as though she were an unassuming grandmother who happened to write clever puzzles. Newspapers painted her as a quiet Englishwoman who somehow rose to literary prominence without any personal complexity. Admirers imagined her as the embodiment of order, control, and intellectual serenity. It was a persona built not only from her gracious public behavior, but from the structure of her own works, stories in which chaos was neatly resolved and justice restored, leaving readers with a sense of calm satisfaction. Yet the woman behind these stories was far more layered. Agatha possessed an inner world shaped by loss, by betrayal, by moments of psychological fracture that she chose never to dissect in public. She carried within her both the softness of compassion and the sharpness of observation. She understood the shadows in people because she had walked through her own. Her quiet demeanor concealed an emotional depth that those closest to her recognized, but the wider world rarely glimpsed. Perhaps this concealment was deliberate. Perhaps it was simply the nature of her character, reserved, introspective, and protective of her private life. Whatever the cause, it created a striking contrast. The public saw order. The private woman lived with the memory of chaos. This duality manifested clearly in the way she approached her work. While readers praised her ability to create puzzles that hinged upon clues and logic, Agatha's real strength lay in her psychological insight. She knew how fear hides itself, how guilt alters behavior, how grief reshapes the mind. These were not academic observations. They were understandings born of lived experience. She had seen firsthand how individuals behave when placed under pressure, both in war and in personal life. Her characters reflect this, each one drawn not merely from imagination, but from her deep reservoir of human observation, the gentle spinster who sees the truth because she has witnessed life's cruelties, the detective whose precision stems from a need to impose order on a disordered world, the villain whose motives grow not from simple malice, but from hidden wounds. These are echoes of a woman who had come to recognize that beneath every carefully arranged surface lies a quiet, trembling truth. Yet the public often miss this depth, choosing instead to view her through the lens of their own comfort. To many, she was a figure of reassurance, her stories a balm in uncertain times, her presence a reminder that some things could still be solved. In an era marked by war, economic hardship, and shifting social structures, readers longed for clarity, and Agatha's work offered a kind of solace they could not find in real life. But this very comfort became a kind of veil. People assumed that she wrote puzzles because her mind was fixed, orderly, and untouched by turmoil. They imagined her as untouched by suffering simply because she did not speak of it. And so, she became a symbol of reliability, while her real self, fragile yet resilient, remained hidden beneath layers the public had no reason to question. Her private journals from these years reveal glimpses of a woman who wrestled with loneliness, even in the midst of companionship, who cherished quiet moments because they allowed her to breathe without the expectations of others. She struggled at times with her health, with bouts of exhaustion, with periods of emotional heaviness that she rarely acknowledged aloud. Yet she continued to work, producing novels at a pace that astonished those who knew the difficulty of maintaining such creativity. Her discipline became a form of resilience, a way of asserting control over the uncertainties that had once nearly consumed her. Writing was not merely craft, it was an anchor. Even Max, who loved her deeply, occasionally failed to perceive the full extent of her emotional complexity. He saw her strength, her wit, her adaptability, but even he admitted in later reflections that Agatha rarely revealed her innermost thoughts. She was in many ways a mystery even to those closest to her, a private woman in a public world, a quiet observer surrounded by people who believed they knew her. Perhaps this was why her partnership with Max worked so well. He did not demand complete transparency. He respected the private spaces of her heart. As the decades unfolded, Agatha's fame grew to global proportions. Her books sold in the millions, adapted into films, radio dramas, and stage productions. Poirot and Miss Marple became cultural fixtures, recognizable to people far removed from the quiet towns of England. Yet with each passing year, the gap between public perception and private truth widened. Readers pictured her at a tidy desk, smiling as she designed intricate plots, unaware of the effort, the emotional labor, and the quiet solitude that went into every page. A paradox emerged. The more adored she became, the more invisible her true self felt. Still, Agatha carried this duality with grace. She had no desire to correct the world's misconceptions. Perhaps she understood that everyone lives behind such veils, some woven by society, some woven by the self. Her silence became a shield and a sanctuary, allowing her to write freely without the burden of explaining herself. And in that silence lay a quiet power. She let her work speak for her, and in doing so, she shaped not only the genre of crime fiction, but the way readers understood human nature. There is a particular image from this period that captures her duality. A small diary drawer kept locked in her home. It contained fragments of writing, personal reflections, ideas half-formed or abandoned, pieces of herself she chose not to share. The drawer remained sealed for years, its contents known only to her. A reminder that every life, no matter how public, contains rooms that remain closed. And in the stillness of that drawer, in the quiet click of its lock, one hears an unanswered question softly echoing within the shadows. The quiet click of the locked drawer lingers in the air like a faint, unresolved note, and from that subtle stillness we move deeper into the realm of questions that history approaches cautiously, the realm of interpretations, rumors, and truths, half hidden beneath layers of time. For Agatha Christie's life, so rich in storytelling and sharpened by personal suffering, became fertile ground for speculation long before her death. People sought explanations for the mysteries she kept private, weaving narratives into the blank spaces she left untouched. And among all the enigmas that surrounded her, none provoked more curiosity than her disappearance. It stood at the center of countless debates, scholarly discussions, psychological analyses, and whispered conversations, each attempting to penetrate a silence she herself had allowed to settle over the incident. In this part of her story, we enter the space where documented facts end and thoughtful conjecture begins. The space where questions through the decades have circled like moths around a dim flame. Why did she vanish? What state of mind carried her into those 11 days of absence? And why did she choose not to reveal the truth, even in later years when she had little left to lose by speaking openly? The lack of answers did not quiet speculation, it fueled it. Scholars, admirers, and even casual readers became detectives of her biography, searching the remnants of her life for clues she never intended to leave. Some believed her disappearance was the product of emotional breakdown, a mind pushed beyond its limits by grief, betrayal, and exhaustion. Supporters of this explanation pointed to her history of sensitivity, her mother's recent death, and the trauma of Archie's affair. They saw her retreat not as an act of calculation, but as the mind protecting itself through dissociation. In their view, the person who checked into the hotel under the name Teresa Neal was not a woman seeking revenge, but someone who had momentarily lost access to the self she had been. They described her condition as a fugue state, a temporary escape into anonymity, where the burdens of her former life could not reach her. Others, however, argued a different interpretation, one that suggested intention rather than confusion. These voices claim she staged her disappearance as a cry for help or as an emotional reaction to Archie's betrayal. They pointed to the details that seemed too aligned: the abandoned car, the chosen alias matching the surname of his lover, the absence of apparent distress during her stay in Harrogate. Some believed she wished to unsettle Archie, force him to confront the consequences of his actions, or draw attention to the fracture in their marriage. Those who supported this theory often overlooked the fragility of her mental state, imagining instead a woman driven by dramatic impulse. Yet those who knew her personally found this interpretation unlikely. Agatha, for all her imaginative power, did not possess the temperament of spectacle. She disliked attention. She recoiled from public scandal. and she would never have deliberately caused distress to her daughter, whose safety she guarded fiercely. Another theory, more nuanced, suggested that her disappearance was a mixture of both states, an act influenced by conscious thought that spiraled into unconscious fracturing once she was alone. According to this view, she may have left her home in distress, seeking escape, without fully intending to create a mystery. Her mind, already fragile, may have slipped into a protective state when she was away from familiar surroundings. This interpretation bridges the gap between intention and amnesia, acknowledging the complexity of emotional collapse. It suggests that human behavior, especially under extreme stress, cannot be explained through simple binaries. And yet, amidst all these conjectures, there exists a quieter hypothesis, seldom voiced but perhaps closest to the essence of truth, that Agatha herself may not have fully understood what drove her into those lost days. Trauma often obscures its own roots. A mind overwhelmed by sorrow does not always leave a clear trail for future reflection. When she chose not to speak of the disappearance, it may not have been secrecy or shame that guided her silence. It may have been the simple impossibility of articulating an experience that had unfolded without conscious reasoning. To explain something requires memory, clarity, and perspective, and she may have possessed none of these with certainty. What history often forgets is that Agatha was not a symbol or mythic figure during those days. She was a wounded human being, a woman trying to navigate the consequences of heartbreak, a mother trying to remain composed for her child, a writer whose inner world had momentarily collapsed under too much weight. To reduce her disappearance to a simple explanation, whether dramatic or clinical, is to diminish the complexity of the human heart. Yet the speculation persisted, and in many ways it never truly ended. Her silence became a canvas upon which others painted their own assumptions. It allowed her disappearance to evolve into something larger than itself, a cultural mystery, a psychological case study, a spectacle of curiosity that reached far beyond the event's original emotional context. And perhaps, without intending to, she became the subject of one of her own unwritten mysteries, a living paradox whose silence deepened the intrigue. But the disappearance was not the only misunderstood aspect of her life. Other truths lay hidden as well. Few knew the depth of her vulnerability. Fewer still understood the quiet strength that allowed her to rebuild her life afterward. Many assumed she lived a life of ease and steady success, unaware of the private anxieties that lingered beneath her outward calm. The literary world often depicted her as a charming but simplistic figure, ignoring the profound insight that shaped her psychological portrayals. Even her personal happiness with Max was occasionally misinterpreted, reduced to a quaint narrative rather than the resilient love story it truly was. There were also professional truths often missed by her critics. Some accused her of formulaic repetition, failing to recognize the revolutionary nature of her contributions to detective fiction. She experimented boldly with narrative structure, challenged conventions in ways subtle yet groundbreaking, and shaped the very form of the mystery genre. Her simplicity was not lack of sophistication, but the deliberate craftsmanship of someone who understood that clarity can be more powerful than embellishment. History, in its haste to categorize, tends to simplify. It compresses complexity into digestible forms, smoothing out contradictions and leaving behind a polished version of reality. But Agatha Christie's story resists such simplification. Her life was marked by quiet contradictions, strength and fragility, brilliance and humility, visibility and secrecy. And within these contradictions lies the essence of her humanity. Toward the end of this reflective chapter, one lingering question remains, soft yet persistent. What does a person truly flee from? A life collapsing around them, or the self that no longer recognizes its own reflection? The question drifts quietly through the air, unanswered, and settles like a shadow in the corner of the room. The lingering question settles like a shadow in the corner of the room, and from that quiet darkness we move into the later years of Agatha Christie's life. A period marked not by dramatic upheaval, but by a gradual slowing of time, the gentle erosion of strength, and the steady approach of an ending that was neither grand nor tragic, but quietly inevitable. These were years in which she walked through the twilight of her own legacy, witnessing her work celebrated across the world, even as her private world grew smaller, more delicate, and increasingly removed from the bright stage upon which her stories continued to shine. For every life has its cost, and even the most extraordinary gifts slowly draw upon one's reserves, leaving behind a subtle loneliness that deepens as age lays its soft hand upon the shoulder. Agatha had spent decades writing with a discipline that astonished those who worked beside her. She drafted manuscripts while traveling through deserts on archaeological expeditions. She wrote in cold English winters, in quiet hotel rooms, in the warmth of summers spent by the sea. Her creativity seemed inexhaustible, her mind continually weaving intricate plots with the same patient logic she had carried since youth. But as she entered her later years, the strain of such productivity, combined with the natural wear of time, began to manifest. The clarity of thought that once moved effortlessly now required more time to summon. Characters she once shaped with precision sometimes slipped from her grip, requiring repeated adjustments or reminders. These changes did not emerge suddenly. They unfolded slowly, like the fading of a long-lit lamp. Max, ever attentive, noticed the shifts before many others. He saw the increasing fatigue, the longer pauses between pages, the faraway look that occasionally settled into her eyes. He did not name these changes aloud. His love was too gentle for bluntness. Instead, he adjusted their routines, shortening travel, slowing down the pace of their archaeological commitments, and creating spaces for rest and contemplation. Their companionship, already deepened by decades of shared life, now took on a tender dimension. He became not only her partner, but her quiet guardian, offering stability as her world began to contract. Yet even in these later years, Agatha's writing did not cease. She continued to craft stories, some filled with nostalgia, others with a reflective tone that hinted at an awareness of her own mortality. Her later works are often dismissed by critics as lacking the sharpness of her earlier masterpieces, but to read them carefully is to sense a quiet resignation, a wistful acknowledgement that time had softened her once razor-like precision. But what they lacked in structural brilliance, they often gained in emotional depth. They carried memories, echoes of earlier decades, and a sense of closure she perhaps offered herself through the endings she wrote on the page. Her home at Winterbrook House became the center of her final years, a place of comfort, filled with familiar rooms, well-loved furniture, and the soft rustle of her garden just beyond the windows. Friends and family visited often. Her daughter Rosalind remained a steady presence, offering companionship without intrusion. Agatha cherished these interactions, yet she increasingly preferred quietness. Life had become a gentle circle of reading, reflecting, writing at a slower pace, and walking along the paths of her garden where flowers bloomed in familiar patterns. Publicly, she was still celebrated, still revered. Fans continued to send letters, gifts, and expressions of gratitude for the worlds she had created. But fame, which had once felt overwhelming, now felt distant, like a memory that belonged to another life. In her later years, she seldom ventured into public events. When she did, she was greeted with admiration, but her responses grew softer, her movements slower. Her face, once bright with the intensity of youth and creative fire, now carried the lines of age, the subtle trace of exhaustion that comes from a life lived fully, perhaps too fully. The world around her also changed in ways that must have felt unsettling. New forms of storytelling emerged: television, modern thrillers, shifting literary trends. Yet her stories endured. They stood untouched by the passing of eras, their clarity and timeless structure continuing to appeal to new generations. This endurance brought her quiet satisfaction, though she did not seek praises nor dwell on her influence. Instead, she held a humble perspective on her achievements, often referring to herself not as a literary figure, but simply a working woman who writes books. Still, there was a loneliness that moved silently through her later years, a loneliness not of solitude, but of the gradual fading of one's internal landscape. Her mind, once vibrant with puzzles and psychological insights, began to dim. She misremembered details, sometimes repeated stories, occasionally forgot names. These moments did not alarm her family, for they unfolded gradually like the soft dimming of twilight. But for Agatha, who had built her life on clarity of thought, the slow erosion of memory may have carried its own quiet sorrow. Her final years contained no great drama, no sudden revelations. They were filled instead with the steady rhythm of a life winding down, with the weight of years resting gently upon her shoulders. She continued to attend some of Max's archaeological gatherings, though mostly as a listener rather than a participant. She found comfort in their shared home, in simple routines, and in the presence of those she loved. And as her physical strength declined, she leaned more on these small certainties, embracing the softness of a life lived at a slower pace. Yet even in decline, she remained a woman of subtle dignity. She was never one to complain, never one to dramatize her discomforts. She accepted aging with a quiet grace, as though she understood that life, like one of her own novels, must eventually reach its final page. And so she lived her last years in a space of calm reflection, aware perhaps that her time was nearing its end, but untroubled by it. When she passed away in January 1976, the world mourned the loss of a literary giant. Obituaries celebrated her achievements, her record-breaking sales, her cultural impact. But the final years she lived were not marked by grandeur. They were marked by simplicity, by love, by the gentle presence of those she cherished. And perhaps that was fitting, for beneath the fame and acclaim, Agatha Christie had always been a woman drawn to quietness. Her end was not tragic. It was something softer, like the closing of a well-worn book after a long evening of reading. And in the stillness of that closing, what remains is not applause or speculation, but the faint, lingering sense of a lamp glowing behind a window in the twilight, steady, warm, and almost forgotten. The faint image of that lamp glowing behind a twilight window lingers in the mind, and from that soft and fading light, we step into the chapter where Agatha Christie's world begins to narrow. Not through sorrow alone, but through the natural contraction that accompanies age, a gradual softening of boundaries, a turning inward, and a quiet reckoning with the life one has lived. This period was neither triumphant nor despairing. It existed somewhere in between, a place where the days passed gently, like the slow ripple of water after a stone has long fallen beneath the surface. For Agatha, the later years were a time when the memories of decades drifted through her thoughts like distant shapes, familiar yet blurred, and when the force that had once driven her to create intricate mysteries gave way to a gentler rhythm, one marked by reflection, domestic comfort, and the quiet acceptance that her greatest work had already been written. By the time she entered her 70s, Agatha had become an almost mythic figure within the literary world, an institution rather than a mere author. Her books were read in dozens of languages, her plays performed across continents, and her characters had taken on a life far beyond her own. Yet while the world continued to speak of her with admiration, the woman herself lived increasingly removed from such attention. Winterbrook House, her home in Oxfordshire, became the center of her days. There, she moved through familiar rooms lined with books, soft chairs, the scent of flowers from her garden, and the peaceful clutter of a life lived quietly but fully. Visitors often remarked on the warmth of her home, noting that it carried the gentle traces of both her English heritage and the distant lands she had traveled with Max. Each room held layers of memory, some recalled clearly, others slipping like soft shadows at the edge of her awareness. It was during this time that her health began to decline noticeably, though never in sudden or theatrical ways. Her energy waned. Tasks that once filled her with quiet joy became more difficult. Her writing, once produced with astonishing discipline, slowed to a near halt. She still attempted to draft stories, still held a pen between her fingers with the habit of decades, but the clarity of thought required to construct a mystery grew elusive. Characters she had shaped with ease now drifted away before she could fully capture them. Plots that once formed in her mind with the precision of clockwork now tangled in ways she could not neatly resolve. This gradual dimming of her creative faculties brought her moments of frustration, though she rarely expressed them openly. She accepted these changes with the same quiet grace that had carried her through earlier hardships. Max stood beside her during these years with unwavering devotion. He had built his own respected career as an archaeologist, yet he always placed her comfort above his professional demands. He spoke to her with a gentleness that had characterized their marriage from its earliest days. When she struggled to remember details or forgot conversations, he responded not with impatience, but with affection, as though the woman before him, however changed, was still the companion who had walked beside him through deserts and ruins. Their love, once strengthened through shared adventure, now deepened through the simple acts of care and presence. He ensured she had quiet mornings, warm rooms, and the comfort of familiar surroundings. It was a partnership that evolved into something tender, something softened by time but unbroken by it. Agatha's circle of acquaintances also shifted during this period. Many of her closest friends from earlier years had either passed away or drifted into their own private lives. New admirers, drawn by her fame, occasionally sought her company, but most encountered a woman who preferred intimacy over public attention. She no longer attended large gatherings, no longer traveled to literary events, and rarely accepted invitations that required elaborate conversation. Instead, she cherished simple visits, tea shared with family members, quiet conversations with trusted friends, gentle walks in her garden when her strength allowed. In these small interactions, she found a sense of peace that the public world could no longer offer her. Yet there remained an undercurrent of melancholy in her later years, the melancholy of a mind that had once been vibrant and now sensed its own fading. She was aware, even if dimly at times, that her mental clarity was slipping from her grasp. Her memory, once sharp enough to craft entire fictional villages and trace their intricate secrets, now faltered in unexpected ways. She repeated stories without realizing it. She struggled to recognize acquaintances who had been part of her life for years, and at times she seemed to drift into a world of her own, one shaped by fragments of the past rather than the present. These changes must have carried a subtle sadness for a woman who had built her legacy upon understanding the delicate workings of the mind. And yet, even in this decline, there was something dignified in her presence. She remained polite, warm, and thoughtful. She continued to read, even if the details of the book slipped away from her hours later. She read detective novels not remembering that she herself had shaped the genre. And when she reread her own works, something she occasionally did in these later years, she sometimes remarked with gentle amusement that the stories seemed new to her. There's a bittersweet beauty in this image. An author meeting her own creations as though encountering them for the first time, freed from the burden of authorship, reading them simply as a woman who enjoyed mysteries. As age continued its slow work, the world beyond Winterbrook felt increasingly distant. The bustling London theatre where The Mousetrap continued its unprecedented run, the foreign publishers issuing new editions of her novels, the readers discovering her for the first time. These realities existed for Agatha only in the faintest sense. She had become, in her final years, a quiet observer of life, rather than an active participant, moving gently through days marked by softness rather than urgency. And though she may not have been fully aware of the ongoing expansion of her legacy, those around her understood they were witnessing the twilight of an extraordinary life. It is perhaps in these later years that one feels the true cost of her genius, the relentless discipline, the emotional intensity required to shape complex psychological worlds, the decades of creative labor, all had taken their toll. She had given so much of herself to her writing that by the end, there was little left of that inner fire. What remained was the woman beneath the legend, a woman shaped by heartbreak, resilience, curiosity, and quiet strength, a woman whose softness endured even as her memory faded. And so, as the late afternoon light in Winterbrook House dimmed each day, Agatha would sometimes sit by the window watching the sky shift from gold to gray, her thoughts drifting like the slow movement of clouds. Perhaps she wondered, in those quiet moments, how much of herself she had left behind in the stories that continued to travel far beyond the reaches of her own years. Outside the window, the garden shimmered softly, the last blooms of the season trembling in the cool evening air, as though holding onto their petals for just a little longer. The trembling petals in the cool evening air linger in the mind, and from that fragile image we move into a more hidden chamber of Agatha Christie's later life, one that holds the forgotten corners of her legacy, the subdued pieces of herself that the world often overlooked or misunderstood. For when a figure becomes as globally recognized as she did, a peculiar thing happens. History remembers the public persona, the grand achievements, the widely circulated stories, and in doing so, it often forgets the quieter truths, the lesser-known works, and the delicate threads that shaped a person's inner world. Agatha Christie was celebrated for her brilliance, her prolific output, her unmatched command of the detective genre. Yet beneath the towering reputation lay small, intimate legacies left behind not in her best-selling novels, but in her personal journals, her unpublished notes, her playful experiments, and the softer philosophies that guided her life. In these forgotten corners, one sees a more complete portrait, one that reveals not only the master of puzzles, but the woman who lived between them. Among the lesser-known aspects of her legacy were the works she wrote under the pseudonym Mary Westmacott. These novels, far removed from the realm of murder and deduction, expressed a side of Agatha rarely recognized by her detective fiction audience. They were stories of human relationships, emotional turmoil, internal conflict, and reflective sadness. In them, she explored the fragile terrain of love, loss, identity, and the yearning for understanding, subjects that touched her personally and deeply. For many years, these works were published without the public knowing they were hers. Readers admired them for their insight and sensitivity, attributing them to an unknown writer with a gentle grasp of human psychology. Agatha cherished this anonymity. Under Westmacott's name, she could speak in a softer, more vulnerable voice, free from the expectations attached to the Christie brand. And in the absence of her own name, she revealed some of the most authentic pieces of her heart. It is telling that she guarded this pseudonym for decades, as though needing a separate space for the emotional truths she could not always express openly. When, many years later, the connection between her name and Westmacott's was revealed, the world expressed surprise that the Queen of Crime could write with such tenderness. Yet this surprise itself betrayed how narrow the public's understanding of her had been. She was never only a writer of murders and puzzles. She was a woman of deep feeling, and the Westmacott novels stand as quiet testimony to the emotional depth she carried behind her composed exterior. Another forgotten dimension of her legacy lies in her personal notebooks, dozens of them, filled with scribbles, loose ideas, stray thoughts, half-formed narratives, sketches of characters, and fragments of overheard conversations. These notebooks reveal a mind constantly engaged in observation, always listening, always questioning. They show her experimenting with plot twists she would later refine, discarding ideas that resurfaced years afterward, and exploring story structures far more complex than the public often gave her credit for. Some of the notebooks contain outlines for novels that were never completed. Others hold personal reflections written in moments of solitude. Taken together, they form a mosaic more intimate than any autobiography, one that shows not only the discipline of her craft, but the vulnerability of her doubts. These notebooks were not written for publication. They were not polished or meant to be seen. And because of this, they capture Agatha as she truly was: curious, methodical, occasionally uncertain, often contemplative, and always searching for meaning. At times, the entries feel almost confessional, revealing glimpses of her emotional state long before the public became aware of her inner struggles. In other entries, her practical mind takes the lead, organizing clues with startling precision. There is a tenderness in these pages, a humanity that contradicts the simplified image of her as an efficient puzzle maker, detached from sentiment. Her plays, too, form part of her overlooked legacy. While The Mousetrap famously became the longest-running play in history, many of her other theatrical works, rich with subtle dialogue and psychological nuance, remain lesser known. These plays reveal her keen ear for human speech and her ability to craft tension not through complexity, but through timing, silence, and the delicate interplay between characters. They reflect how deeply she understood the ways people mask their emotions and how their quietest gestures can reveal the most. Beyond her written works, there were other forgotten legacies as well. Agatha was a woman of quiet generosity, something she seldom spoke of. She supported numerous charities, often anonymously. She donated funds to archaeological projects she and Max believed in. She helped friends in financial difficulty without drawing attention to herself. And in her later years, she took joy in funding scholarships for aspiring archaeologists, understanding that Max's world, like hers, depended on young people who could carry its passion into the future. These acts of kindness rarely made it into public accounts of her life, yet they were as much a part of her legacy as her novels. Then there were the domestic rituals she left behind, rituals remembered by family members more fondly than any literary accomplishment. Her love of gardening, her fondness for simple meals shared quietly in rooms filled with sunlight, the way she arranged flowers in vases with gentle care, her habit of listening rather than speaking, of asking soft questions rather than offering opinions. These small gestures, forgotten by history, reveal the essence of the woman behind the name, a woman who sought tranquility in everyday routines, even as her fame spiraled beyond anything she could have anticipated. And yet perhaps the most overlooked legacy of all is the emotional cost of her achievements. Agatha's life was shaped by personal losses that rarely made their way into public narratives. The death of her mother left a wound that only deepened with time. The betrayal of her first husband reshaped her sense of identity. The disappearance that followed became a shadow she carried quietly, long after the world moved on from it. These experiences informed her writing, but also exacted a toll, one often invisible to those who saw only the steady stream of books bearing her name. In the forgotten corners of her legacy, we discover a woman far richer and more complex than the public image that survived her. A woman who wrote not simply to entertain, but to understand. A woman whose silence hid truths too personal to share. A woman who navigated life with gentleness, even when her heart was heavy. And so, as dust gathers softly on the covers of old notebooks, settling like a faint memory across their pages, one feels the quiet presence of stories that never reached the world, stories she kept for herself, woven from the private moments that shaped her inner life. In the dimness of those forgotten shelves, a small notebook lies still, its pages untouched for years, holding a fragment of her voice that now waits in silence. The small notebook lying untouched gathers its quiet dust, and from that stillness we move into the realm where memory begins to shift. where the world's recollection of Agatha Christie grows blurred by simplification, misunderstanding, and the soft erosion that time brings to every life. For no matter how carefully history tries to preserve a figure, it inevitably shapes them to suit its own narratives, smoothing their edges, reducing their complexities, and carving away the shadows that once gave them depth. Agatha, despite her remarkable influence, was no exception. As her work spread across continents and through generations, she became not only the queen of crime, but a symbol, iconic, familiar, and often misunderstood. In this space, where legend meets reality, we explore how history remembers her incorrectly, gently peeling back the layers to reveal the woman beneath the myth. In the decades after her death, the public image of Agatha Christie solidified into something almost caricature-like, a kindly grandmotherly figure, crafting polite puzzles from the comfort of an English armchair, untouched by turbulence, unaffected by passion, and serenely insulated from the darker currents of human experience. This image was comforting, simple, and easy to repeat. It fit neatly within the cozy mystery genre that had grown around her name, and it suited the sentimental nostalgia readers often attached to beloved authors. But the truth of her life, its emotional depths, its periods of turmoil, its moments of fear and psychological vulnerability, did not align with this gentle portrait. History often prefers the neat version of a story, and so, Agatha's life was condensed into a few familiar notes. The prolific author, the creator of Poirot and Miss Marple, the master of twists, the charming public figure whose stories never grew old. Her disappearance was mentioned as a curious anecdote rather than an emotional fracture. Her heartbreak was glossed over. Her interior world, rich with sensitivity, shaped by grief and inner shadows, was seldom acknowledged. As the decades passed, her identity became so entwined with her works that the woman herself faded behind them. One of the most persistent misremembrances was the assumption that her writing reflected a naive or quaint view of the world. Critics, especially in the latter half of the 20th century, often dismissed her as formulaic, as though her clarity indicated a lack of sophistication. Yet this misinterpretation overlooked the revolutionary nature of her work. Agatha was one of the first authors to use psychological misdirection with subtlety. She wove themes of memory, perception, and emotional concealment long before psychological thrillers became fashionable. Her insights into human motives were not accidental. They were born from years of observing people with keen sensitivity. But her reserved nature, combined with the deceptive simplicity of her style, caused many to underestimate the depth behind her craft. Even the genre she helped define suffered from being perceived as light literature. Readers often saw her novels as cozy, predictable, or neatly packaged, but beneath their surface lay darker truths, explorations of trauma, loss, greed, loneliness, and moral ambiguity. Her characters, though sometimes sketched with broad strokes, often embodied quiet tragedies, children shaped by neglect, women trapped by social expectations, men haunted by private failures. She understood how guilt festers, how secrets corrode the heart, and how ordinary people can be driven to extraordinary acts. These insights were not the reflections of a sheltered mind. They were the reflections of a woman who had lived through profound emotional rupture. Another misunderstanding lies in the way many people retroactively interpreted her disappearance. Over the years, sensationalists preferred to present it as a theatrical stunt or a calculated act of revenge. But such interpretations ignored the fragility and vulnerability that defined her mental state at the time. They also ignored her lifelong aversion to public spectacle. To portray her disappearance as manipulative is to erase the truth of her suffering, to transform a deeply human moment of collapse into a dramatic plot she never intended to write. This misreading of her life reveals more about society's appetite for drama than about her actual character. Perhaps one of the most curious distortions involves her relationship with femininity. Some depict Agatha as the quintessentially traditional English woman, embodying domestic modesty and quietness. Yet she was far more unconventional than this suggests. She traveled widely at a time when few women did. She joined archaeological expeditions, lived for months in tents in the Middle East, wrote prolifically in challenging conditions, negotiated contracts with confidence, and built a global literary empire, all while maintaining a modest public demeanor. She inhabited spaces where women were seldom seen, and she did so with quiet competence rather than loud rebellion. This subtle strength is often overshadowed by the outdated image of her as a sweet old lady writer. Even her marriage to Max, often simplified into a neat romantic narrative, carried complexity. Their partnership was rooted in deep respect and companionship, but it also involved long separations, demanding work, and the emotional labor of supporting each other's careers. Agatha was not simply a supportive wife. She was a partner whose intellectual contributions Max valued sincerely. Yet this nuance is often overlooked, overshadowed by the sentimentalized version of their marriage. As the decades moved forward, the world's relationship with Agatha Christie shifted again. Her works remained widely read, but new generations approached her through adaptations, television films, radio dramas, modern retellings, and stylized remakes that reshaped her characters to suit contemporary tastes. Some adaptations distorted her intent, turning Poirot into a theatrical eccentric or Miss Marple into a caricature of quaint wisdom. These portrayals, though entertaining, further distanced the public from the author's original understanding of her characters. Characters rooted not in stereotypes, but in nuanced observation. And beyond these distortions lies the greatest simplification of all, the reduction of her legacy to mere entertainment. Agatha Christie's works certainly entertained millions, but they also reflected deep truths about human experience. They offered moral clarity in a chaotic world. They acknowledge that evil exists not only in violent acts but in quiet resentments and hidden grievances. They explored the loneliness of villagers, the anxieties of everyday people, the weight of conscience. They revealed how fragile identity can be and how easily the mind can fracture under pressure. Yet history, eager for neat categories, often forgets this. It remembers the clever plots, the surprising twists, the elegant structure. It forgets that behind each story stood a woman who knew suffering intimately, who wrote not from detachment, but from empathy. As time continues its slow erosion, what remains of Agatha Christie in the cultural imagination is both true and incomplete. A brilliant mind, yes, but also a softened silhouette, missing its shadows. And somewhere in the quiet rooms of her empty house, an unspoken memory rests on a shelf, never shared, almost forgotten, holding a truth that history no longer seeks. The unspoken memory resting on the quiet shelf lingers like a breath held in stillness. And from that soft presence, we now step into the final great mystery that shadows Agatha Christie's life. The one that refuses resolution even after her death, the enigma that scholars and readers continue to ponder with both fascination and restraint. For in every life there remains an unanswered question, a moment that time cannot fully illuminate. And for Agatha, that question is not merely why she disappeared, but what her disappearance revealed about the inner workings of a mind so finely tuned to understanding the subtleties of human nature. As we enter this chapter, we do so not to solve the riddle, but to stand before it with the contemplative respect one brings to an ancient ruin whose foundations still whisper fragments of truth. The disappearance of 1926 has persisted as the central unresolved moment in Agatha's story, a patch of shadow in an otherwise well-documented life. It is not only the event itself that intrigues people, but the way it echoes patterns found throughout her writing: amnesia, mistaken identity, psychological fracture, the tension between inner and outer selves. readers cannot resist the temptation to see the episode as part of a larger narrative, perhaps even a key to understanding her creative mind. Yet each attempt to decipher it leads to interpretations as varied as the characters in her novels, each one plausible, each one incomplete. Some scholars argue that the disappearance marked a fracture in her consciousness, a moment when the emotional weight of sorrow overwhelmed her ability to function within her ordinary identity. They suggest that her mind, in an act of self-preservation, allowed a new persona to emerge, Theresa Neale, creating a temporary retreat from unbearable reality. Supporters of this view point to her gentle behavior in Harrogate, her calm demeanor, her apparent lack of awareness of the search unfolding around her. Their argument rests on the premise that dissociation can arise not only from trauma, but from prolonged emotional strain, and that a mind as sensitive as Agatha's may have sought refuge through altered awareness. Others propose a more symbolic interpretation. They see her disappearance not as an escape from reality, but as a journey into an interior landscape, one where sorrow, fear, and the longing for reinvention coexisted. According to this perspective, the incident served as a threshold moment, a transition from one self to another. Before it, she was Agatha Miller turned Christie, a wife defined by her devotion and identity shaped by marriage. After it, she became the Agatha who stood alone, who rebuilt herself, who discovered independence, who crafted a life with Max rooted not only in affection, but in mutual respect. This reading frames her disappearance as a quiet act of becoming, the mind shedding its old skin through a dreamlike passage. Another interpretation, more philosophical than psychological, suggests that her disappearance reflected the burden of her gift. Agatha's genius was rooted in her ability to observe, to intuit motives, to capture the tensions beneath everyday life. Such sensitivity can be both blessing and curse. A mind attuned to subtle emotional shifts may be easily overwhelmed when those shifts occur with great force. Her disappearance, then, can be seen as an unconscious response to the contradictions she carried within her. A gentle woman who understood brutality, a private person with public fame, a seeker of truth who sometimes needed the mercy of forgetting. In this sense, her disappearance becomes a mirror held up to the complexity of being human, revealing not weakness, but the delicate balance between the inner and outer worlds. There is also a quieter, almost poetic reading, one that sees her disappearance as the moment when life imitated the very mysteries she wrote. Throughout her novels, characters slip between identities, memories fade or sharpen unpredictably, and truth emerges in unexpected ways. It is tempting to imagine that Agatha's own life briefly followed such a pattern, as though she stepped into the realm she had so often crafted, where reality bends to the contours of emotion rather than reason, not because she intended to, but because the human mind sometimes echoes the stories it knows best. This interpretation does not seek to solve her disappearance. It sees in the incident a kind of gentle symmetry, a moment where the storyteller became, however briefly, the story. Yet for all these interpretations, one truth remains constant. Agatha guarded her silence. She did not attempt to rewrite the narrative others formed. She did not insist upon a particular version of events. She allowed the mystery to stand untouched by explanation. Even in her autobiography, written with candor, wit, and surprising vulnerability, she offered no clarity about those 11 days. She passed over them like a stone skipping lightly across water, acknowledging their existence but never pausing long enough for reflection. This silence is itself a clue, though one that leads not to a solution but to a deeper understanding. Some experiences, especially those born of profound emotional pain, cannot be revisited without reopening wounds that time has only delicately sealed. Her silence protects the fragility of that moment. It protects the delicate architecture of her mind, the part of her that survived by retreating into shadow. And it protects the private truth she carried, whatever it was, from the insistent hands of curiosity. In withholding her account, she preserved a piece of herself from the world's interpretations. She left behind a space for contemplation, a space where readers and scholars can linger, not to solve the mystery, but to reflect upon the nature of mystery itself. For perhaps the deepest question raised by her disappearance is not, what happened? But why do we feel compelled to know? What is it in human beings that seeks resolution so urgently? Why do we struggle to accept ambiguity, even when life so often presents it? Agatha seemed to understand this impulse, yet she also knew that some truths are softened, not revealed by silence. Some mysteries endure not because they resist explanation, but because explaining them would diminish their meaning. In the end, her disappearance remains a mirror, one that reflects the fears, hopes, and longings of those who contemplate it. It reveals our discomfort with uncertainty and our tendency to impose narratives upon things we do not understand. And in acknowledging this, we come closer not to solving the riddle of her disappearance, but to grasping the delicate humanity behind it. As we close this reflection, the memory of her abandoned car returns once more. The headlights dim, the night folds around it. The truth hovers just beyond reach, like a whisper carried on the cold December wind, and the whisper fades before it can be fully heard. The whisper that fades before it can be fully heard drifts into a deeper silence, and from that fragile quiet we now enter a space of reflection, one in which Agatha Christie's story, with all its shadows and unanswered questions, reveals why it continues to hold the world in its gentle grasp. For mysteries endure not merely because they lack solutions, but because they echo something within us, something universal and human, the longing to understand ourselves, the fear of what lies hidden in our own depths, and the quiet hope that even in darkness there may be meaning. As we stand in the afterglow of her life's narrative, it becomes clear that Agatha's story has endured for reasons more profound than fame alone. It has endured because it speaks to the tender places within us, the places shaped by loneliness, resilience, secrecy, and the unspoken spaces of the heart. It is tempting to view Agatha Christie as an extraordinary figure whose experiences lie beyond the reach of ordinary lives. But when one steps closer, when one looks past the public image and the carefully crafted stories, one finds a woman whose struggles resemble the quiet battles many face. She knew loss intimately, the loss of her father in childhood, the loss of her mother as an adult, the loss of a marriage that had once shaped her identity. She knew the fear of not belonging, of being misunderstood, of slipping into a silence too deep to articulate. She knew the fragile nature of the mind, the way it can fracture under sorrow and seek refuge in places we cannot name. And yet she also knew how to rebuild, how to rise quietly without spectacle or bitterness, and shape a new life from broken pieces. These elements of her story resonate deeply because they reflect the subtle truths of human experience. They remind us that even those who appear composed, successful, and admired may harbor inner storms. They show that resilience does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it exists in the soft determination to keep moving, to keep creating, to keep loving despite the heart's hesitations. Agatha's later years, marked by quiet routines, the gentle companionship of Max, and the gradual slowing of her once brilliant mind, reflect a universal truth as well, that life narrows toward its end, not with sudden drama, but with a soft dimming of the lights that once burned brightly. But perhaps what haunts us most about her story is the realization that she, the master of constructing puzzles, became the center of one. Her disappearance underscores a paradox that touches many of us, that a person may be known by millions and yet remain unknowable at their core, that even those who articulate human motives with precision may have depths they choose not to reveal. And in this paradox lies the quiet thread of doubt that has kept her story alive in the collective imagination, There is something deeply comforting in the idea that a person does not have to be wholly understood to be loved or remembered. Agatha's life suggests that the gaps, the silences, the gentle ambiguities in a person's story are not flaws, but part of what makes their narrative enduring. Her disappearance, rather than diminishing her, softened her legacy with humanity, reminding readers that the authors of our most beloved stories are themselves shaped by mystery. This blending of public fascination and private fragility also reveals something about the world that embraced her. In the years following her return, England itself was navigating uncertain terrain, recovering from war, grappling with new social freedoms, confronting the shifting roles of women. Her disappearance arrived at a moment when the public was eager to make sense of its own changing identity, and Agatha, already a figure woven into the fabric of British culture, became an unexpected mirror. Her temporary absence felt symbolic, a reflection of a society that had lost something essential and was trying to locate itself again. When she returned, it was as though she carried silently the message that even shattered things can be reclaimed. Her writing, too, served as a balm during these years. It offered a structured world in which every question, no matter how troubling, found an answer. In her stories, order triumphed over chaos, justice over deceit, clarity over confusion. People turned to her books in moments of personal and national uncertainty because they offered a temporary refuge from the randomness of life. Even today, her works continue to soothe readers around the world, not because they are simple, but because they restore a sense of balance that feels increasingly rare. Yet as much as her stories provide resolution, her life gently reminds us that not all puzzles are meant to be solved. There is a calm wisdom in this contrast. Through her writing, she offered the comfort of answers. Through her life, she offered the reminder that answers are not always necessary. A mystery may endure, not as a source of confusion, but as a quiet place where reflection can dwell. This is perhaps why her story continues to weave itself into the thoughts of those who encounter it. People of all ages and from all places find themselves drawn to her, not just to her books, but to the quiet enigma of her character. Elderly readers revisit her works for their reassuring clarity. Younger readers discover in her a storyteller whose prose feels timeless. Scholars analyze her disappearance with restless curiosity, and ordinary people, reading her biography late into the night, find in her vulnerability something deeply familiar. Her story becomes a soft companion to those navigating their own periods of uncertainty, whispering that it is possible to endure what feels unbearable, possible to rebuild oneself, possible to find meaning even after the mind has wandered into places it cannot explain. Toward the end of this reflective chapter, one begins to feel that Agatha's legacy is not only a literary one, it is a human one. It is the legacy of someone who lived through sorrow and yet chose to create worlds of light, someone who experienced personal collapse and yet rebuilt herself without bitterness, someone who understood the human heart not through theory, but through living. And so the quiet pages of her life invite us to reflect. What makes a person's story linger in the world long after they are gone? Is it the achievements, the fame, the accolades? Or is it the echo of their humanity, the parts of themselves that touched others without needing to explain how or why? As these questions drift through the mind, a soft sound arises. The turning of a page somewhere in a dim room, a reader continuing one of her stories late into the night, the whisper of her voice carried across time, not through certainty, but through gentle mystery. And that turning page becomes the final echo of this reflection, leading us toward the last chapter of her tale. The soft turning of that page settles into the quiet of a dim room, and from that gentle rustle, we enter the final stretch of Agatha Christie's long, intricate tale, a space where her life, her legacy, and the echoes of her mysteries converge into a single, lingering presence. It is here, in this last contemplative passage, that we step back to behold the full shape of her journey. The young girl riding alone by lamplight, the woman broken by grief, the storyteller who built worlds that offered order in chaos, and the elder figure whose quiet endurance carried her far beyond the turmoil she once feared. In these closing moments, we reflect not only on what she created, but on what she left behind, a legacy that extends far beyond literature, reaching into the hearts and quiet rhythms of those who still find solace within her stories. As time moved on after her passing, the world did not simply remember her. It continued to live alongside her. Her books never drifted into obscurity. Instead, they multiplied, translated into new languages, adapted for new eras, reinvented for radio, film, and stage. Her characters, Poirot with his meticulous logic, Miss Marple with her gentle insight, the countless figures who populate her novels, walked into new generations of readers, each generation believing it had discovered something precious. There is a peculiar longevity in her work that seems almost indifferent to trends. Long after other forms of fiction have risen and faded, her stories endure, as though they carry within them something essential, something that does not age. Perhaps this is because her writing does not merely entertain. It reassures. It provides a form of clarity that life rarely grants. In a world where uncertainty often prevails and motives remain hidden, her stories offer the comfort of resolution. The darkness she depicts never triumphs without explanation. The chaos she presents is always unraveled by the end. And though real life seldom grants such neat conclusions, the human mind longs for them, perhaps more than it knows. Agatha understood this longing with a sensitivity honed by her own experiences. She knew intimately the feeling of standing before unanswered questions. She knew the discomfort of confusion, the ache of uncertainty, and so she gave her readers, again and again, the gift she herself once needed most, a path toward understanding. Yet her legacy extends beyond the boundaries of genre or comfort. Through her work, she also revealed a profound truth about human nature, that beneath the surface of even the quietest lives lie hidden tensions, unspoken desires, private wounds, and unacknowledged fears. She did not write of criminals as monstrous figures, but as people shaped by circumstance, loneliness, greed, envy, or desperation. She understood that darkness rarely appears without origin, and in presenting this understanding, she offered not judgment but recognition, a gentle acknowledgement that human beings are rarely simple, rarely wholly good or wholly wicked. Her stories remind us that truth lies in nuance, that motives cannot be reduced to a single line, that the heart contains contradictions. Even now, readers turn to her not only for entertainment, but for companionship. Her books accompany travelers on trains and planes. They sit on nightstands beside those seeking comfort before sleep. They rest on library shelves waiting for readers who need a moment of order in a disordered world. And in these quiet encounters, her presence endures. She has become a kind of guardian of calm, not through moral certainty, but through the quiet promise that every tangled thread can be followed, every hidden truth uncovered. But the fullness of her legacy is not found only in her writing. It is also found in the humanity that threads through her life story, the resilience she embodied, the kindness she extended to others, the humility with which she approached her success. Even at the height of her fame, she remained wary of the spotlight, choosing the warm simplicity of home over public grandeur. She preserved her privacy with gentle firmness, refusing to allow the world's curiosity to erode the spaces that sheltered her inner life. In doing so, she demonstrated a strength that was not dramatic but enduring, the strength to protect one's quietness in a world that continually demands revelation. Her life also offers a lesson in reinvention. Agatha's early adulthood was marked by heartbreak that nearly consumed her. Her disappearance was not only a crisis, but a collapse of the identity she had once carried. And yet she did not remain in that shadow. She rebuilt herself slowly, tenderly, forming a new life with Max, rediscovering her creativity and forging a second adulthood that blossomed in ways she had not foreseen. Her journey is a reminder that brokenness does not have to be the final chapter, that even when the mind falters, even when the heart shatters, something new can emerge, fragile at first, then steady, then quietly radiant. As the decades passed after her death, scholars continued to study her, readers continued to adore her, and filmmakers continued to reinterpret her. Each medium brought new perspectives, some faithful, some wandering far from her intent. But within these varied interpretations, one thing remained constant: the recognition that she had shaped not only a genre, but a way of thinking. Her name became synonymous with the mystery itself, with puzzles, clues, motives, secrets, and the slow unveiling of truth. In a sense, she became immortal not through the details of her life, but through the architecture of the worlds she built. Yet her final and perhaps most profound legacy lies in what she represented beyond writing. In an age when women struggled for recognition, she carved a place not through loud rebellion, but through persistence, talent, and an unyielding belief in her craft. She demonstrated that brilliance can be expressed quietly, that influence does not require spectacle, that greatness can emerge from gentleness. Her life gave shape to a form of strength that is often overlooked, the strength of subtlety, the strength of restraint, the strength of empathy. And so, in these final contemplative moments, we are left with the image of her legacy, not as a towering monument, but as a quiet light, steady, warm, enduring. A light that continues to glow in libraries, in bookshops, in homes across oceans and generations. A light that guides readers through mysteries, not of crime alone, but of the heart. As the last page of her story turns, the ink dries on a final line that needs no boldness, no flourish, a line shaped by a life that balanced creation and silence, sorrow and renewal, mystery and clarity. And as that final page settles into its place, the light fades gently, leaving behind not darkness, but a lingering warmth, the kind that remains when a story has reached its end, yet continues to echo softly in the mind.